It's very easy today to outsource everything. To outsource anything and everything you want. You can outsource your cooking. You can outsource your cleaning. You can outsource your housekeeping. You can outsource every aspect of your life if you wanted to, except for the job that you do and your time with your family. And we've been moving in that direction for decades now. And I think in the last 10 years, we have started to see a fight back against it, against outsourcing everything in our lives. And we're taking a lot of the things that we've started outsourcing back to find fulfillment and enjoyment out of them as projects, as hobbies, as things that we are doing ourselves. And this is taking the form of the DIY, or the do-it-yourself culture, where people want to bake their own bread, they want to brew their own beer, they want to build their own computers. These are things you do not have to do, but we're seeing an emergence of people who want to do them for the experience and the enjoyment and the fulfillment that it gives them. And decorating with your own visual art is so much more emotionally impactful than buying wall art, even very good wall art, that you could get when you're on vacation or go to a normal shop for. And photography needs to fit into this conversation about creating something meaningful of your own, because it couldn't exist any other way. In this course, I'm going to be challenging you. I'm going to be hopefully inspiring you to take back the enjoyment in photography and in creating your own art of the experiences in your life. This is as personal an art form as I can imagine, and one accessible to everybody. Along the way, I'm going to be stressing the tools of consistency. It was, I believe, Steve Martin who said, referring to stand-up comedy at the time, it's easy to be great, but it's difficult to be good. Meaning that even somebody mediocre at a craft will have a good night. Even somebody with no experience in photography can take a great photograph. The test of being good at your art or good at your craft is the consistency of your results. And that's what we're going to be stressing. We're going to be talking about the theory behind how and why we make decisions. We'll be talking about the mechanics of actually deciding one way of doing something versus another, or one way of adjusting to an environment versus another. And we're going to have practical examples where you're going to come along with me on shoots in order to see the decision-making process in action. I am so glad to have you coming along with me on this ride. My name is Joe, and thank you. How do you teach photography? How do you teach an art form that has a mechanical side to it? We have this camera that we want to be able to operate, and then we need to make theory-based decisions on the outcomes that we want in the environment that we're in. Well, here's going to be the way that we're going to tackle it. A camera is, at its core, two systems. First, it is a system for understanding how much light there is in the subject and on the scene, and then the tools that it has at its disposal to adapt to that light, and we call that the exposure system. Your camera is also a system for understanding the distance to a subject and then focusing the lens to that distance. And of course, that is the focusing system. So we're going to broadly divide up this class into the exposure system and the focusing system. And along the way, we need to understand the working components of each one of these systems and the things you will be adjusting as you make exposure decisions. Now, how do we understand those? And how do we reinforce the decision-making process for the consistency that we were talking about? Well, here's how we're going to do it. We're going to examine each one of the major tools at your disposal from 3 vantage points. The first is going to be theory. You have to have theory under your belt in order to have any reasonable expectation of making decisions with the tool that you have at your disposal. People without theory try to memorize everything. They compensate by trying to memorize everything. They have pages of notes about the settings for shooting this situation and the settings for shooting that situation. And it's all unnecessary, because every situation in photography we approach from exactly the same perspective and with the same tools. So if you have theory under your belt, you're going to be able to make decisions better in more circumstances. But we also have to have a mechanical side, and that's the second vantage point that we're going to be viewing each tool from. We have a camera, and we have to be able to make adjustments that correspond to the theory. We have to have tools that we can operate in order to get the results that we want. So that's a mechanical approach. Thirdly, we are going to have to practice. We have to get out and shoot. You have to go and take pictures and make mistakes and learn from them and adjust things on the fly. That reinforces the theory so that it makes more sense, and it makes you faster at the mechanics, making adjustments on the fly with your camera. So we're going to examine each one of the core components or tools at our disposal from each one of these 3 vantage points. And that's going to be the structure of our class. What gear do you need in order to take maximum advantage of this course? Well, you need some form of an interchangeable lens camera. Those are going to be all different varieties and capabilities and, of course, costs, but some form of interchangeable lens camera is going to be essential. And this piece right here is my recorder for recording stuff for the course, so you can ignore that part. But we have to have some kind of interchangeable lens camera, and then, of course, we're going to need some kind of lens. Now, we're going to have a little section in a little bit that is going to be on lenses and depth of field. But initially, we need a lens, and I want to introduce you to a couple components of a lens. So if I have my lens here, this piece right here is my lens hood, and it's important if the lens comes with it. I tend to not stress about it if a lens does not come with it, but you will always see me shoot throughout this course with my lenses with their lens hoods attached. So that's a lens hood. Then I have my lens, and I have my front cap here, and I have my rear cap here. So whenever you shoot, you're going to take your lens hood and you're going to put it on, which of course is going to be facing this way. You will always see me shoot with a lens hood on. Indoor, outdoor, doesn't matter. They do a couple things. They block any light from streaking or reflecting off of the front glass of the lens. They're also just a very inexpensive front impact protection piece, and if the manufacturer gives them to you, I think that you should use them. Whenever you're not using a lens hood, we can store them backwards. Now, it's not doing anything. I see people shoot with their lens hood like this, and I don't understand what they're doing, because it does not do a single thing. It's just storage. But if your lens hood never leaves your lens, you never lose it. And they're actually shockingly difficult to replace in a convenient or easy manner. We're going to take off our front cap, and now we have the body cap of the camera here. So always make sure your camera is off whenever you change lenses. That should just pop straight off. We take the rear cap off of the lens, and there should be some kind of dot-to-dot lineup system, and that's going to let you put the lens, of course, onto your camera. Now, a little trick for you, since essentially these are molded to be the actual camera mount there and the lens mount there, they do lock together, and I like to do that to make sure that I don't lose anything. So that's going to be attaching a lens. Now, you have to have a memory card of some kind, and I'm going to tell you that I personally believe speed is more important than capacity. Everyone seems to think that they need a 64 gig memory card, and it holds thousands more pictures than they're probably going to shoot, in an individual photographic session or day, and yet they'll buy a high capacity that's very low in speed. So I have moved out of class 10 memory cards entirely, and I'm into only U3 memory cards at this moment in time. If we see faster memory cards become the norm, I'll probably update to those. But fast memory to me is essential because it allows me to shoot video, it allows me to shoot stills in sequence, and it allows me to shoot my raw images without the camera slowing down. So high-speed memory, important. We've got our lens on there. What else do we need? Tripod. Some kind of a tripod that you rely on. I've never understood people having thousands of dollars in camera gear and then putting it onto a $50 tripod. I've never understood that. I'm not saying buy more tripod than you really are going to use or need, but when I put my gear onto a tripod, I need to feel comfortable walking away from it. And this one here, this is a carbon fiber tripod, which is of course very nice. I love carbon fiber. I bring it with me to lots of places, so it's nice and light, but something that you feel comfortable and steady with. You want something that does not have those little connecting points in between the legs. That's always a sign of cheapness. You want the legs to be free so that they can adjust independently. If you have twist locks, make sure that they feel convenient. There's a lot of twist locks that are really aggravating to work with. These ones here are snap locks, so they just open and snap shut, which is nice. Some of those need to be adjusted from time to time. But make sure that it feels solid and that's going to last you and that you feel comfortable putting expensive gear onto. So a nice tripod is important. And then some kind of a camera bag where you feel comfortable being able to store everything that you have. If you store everything inside of one place, you never lose anything. You're not losing your chargers, you're not losing your cables, you're not losing your memory cards. So that's nice. It needs to be something that you feel comfortable carrying, nice and padded, both on the shoulder strap and of course inside of it. Something that you feel comfortable putting your gear inside of and moving it. Some people like over-the-shoulder bags, some people like backpacks, whatever you like, something that you feel comfortable with and that you're going to use for a long time. You want to make sure that it's very usable. I've got several camera bags that I like and I use them for different purposes. You're going to find that if you have several pieces of gear like I've got multiple lenses here, camera, that you might have different camera bags to accommodate different amounts of stuff that you might be traveling with. Outside of that, you're in pretty good shape, right? Camera, memory card, bag. We're going to be talking about lenses, but lenses are really going to be the real addiction in your photography because a different lens will be able to accomplish a different job. After that, you're in good shape to go out and start shooting. So those are the pieces that you need to start your photographing journey. So what is the nature of light? That's really where we want to begin in our photographic journey. We want to understand the nature of light. And why? The reason is quite simple. The only tool we have as photographers is light. It's what carries all information in photography. It's our recording medium. It's everything. It is what we have to work with. It's how we create our end result, our art. So we need to understand light. And I want to introduce you to a couple concepts of understanding light. We expand more on this in classes where we talk about studio lighting and flash photography, which is beyond the scope of what we want to accomplish in this Essentials course. But to give you a little bit of a preview, if I understand 5 things about light, 5, then I can understand that light source in all photographic sense, and I can work with it in any way that I want. So I like to understand 5 things about a light source. The first thing is its brightness. How bright is the light source? This is something we call its luminosity, but you could just say brightness. The second thing is how hard or soft the light source is, which is something that we call its specularity. We care about its light contrast or value contrast to other light sources. We care about its direction relative to the subject, and we care about its color temperature. Now, in lighting classes, we talk quite a bit about specularity and contrast, and we're going to put those aside for this class and deal with just really the three most important ones, which we think about anytime that we're about to take a picture or shoot a video. We think about its brightness, its direction, and its color temperature. Now later on in class, we are going to talk about color temperature. We're going to talk about mixed color temperatures. We're going to talk about manual white balancing. So that's in a class coming up. It's important, but we're going to be dealing with it separately. Right now, I want to talk about brightness and direction and how they relate to each other. Okay? So here is the first habit I want to give you as a photographer. You walk into a new environment where you're going to shoot some stills or you're going to shoot some video. I want you to start, before shooting anything or picking up the camera, just noticing the light in the environment. Where is it coming from? What's it hitting? What's it not hitting? What brightness level is it? What direction is it relative to my subject? Is my subject being backlit, side lit, or front lit? How far above the subject is the light? In other words, is it casting shadows downwards onto the face? Is it casting them more behind because the light's on parity with the subject? Notice the light in an environment, its brightness, its direction. Now, the second thing you'll notice is that knowing brightness and direction of light is meaningless until I've identified a subject, because I'm placing all of these values in relationship to my subject. So the second thing, the second habit, is noticing what I want my subject to be. What do I want my subject to be? And that's not as directly easy a question to answer as you might expect. So this shot is pretty easy. You've got a subject, you've got a background. Okay, the subject is going to be the person talking. And we want the person's face to be in focus. That's a pretty easy shot to identify the subject. But what if it's a flower and I'm shooting very up close? Well, not all of the flower will be in focus. Now I've got to choose what part of the flower do I want to have be the subject matter. What about if I'm shooting a landscape picture and I've got this nice scene, but I need to decide where I'm actually focusing and what light I really care about. Is it the light on the mountain range or the trees or the rocks? I need to think about that. I need to decide that subject in the shot. So it's not as easy as necessarily this person's face. But I need to be in the habit of thinking of these things. What is my subject? And where is the light and what's the light's brightness relative to that subject? If I develop those two habits, I'm going to be faster at making intelligent decisions as a photographer. So we're noticing light, we're noticing its direction, we're noticing its brightness relative to a subject, and this starts helping us identify the light we care about from the light we don't care about. So let's just examine the scene that you're looking at right now. I have in this scene really two light sources, but I want to deal with them as three. The first light source, of course, is sunlight. Now it's coming in through the window, and it's lighting the background of the backyard behind me, but it's also coming in through the windows of this room and bouncing around and creating a little bit of what we call ambient light. Now, an ambient light is a light source I really don't control on a photographic basis. And to explain that, I would call a light source a photographic light source. A light source I control photographically if I can control all five aspects of it. If I control its brightness, its contrast, its specularity, its white balance, and its direction. Sunlight, I really can't control like that. Now you might say, oh, you could pull those shades behind you and it will diffuse the light. Well, that's controlling a little bit of specularity, but I'm not controlling its direction. I'm not controlling its brightness or its intensity. I'm certainly not controlling its white balance. So I can't control sunlight in a photographic sense. I can try to adjust or modify this ambient light. The same is true for the light in the room. It's bouncing around the room and gives me this kind of low-level shot, this low-level kind of exposure, but I don't control it photographically. The third light source is, of course, the video light that's lighting me. It's the one that's really lighting up my face, because since my back is to a window, there's no way I'm being lit by that sunlight coming in through the window. Now, this is a light source that I do control photographically. I control it in brightness because it's dimmable. I control its specularity and its contrast, because I could put modifiers onto it, or I could change its position or its brightness relative to the ambient light in the shot. I certainly control its direction because I can place it anywhere I want it to be. It's on a light stand right now. And I can control its color temperature by gelling it. So the video light here is a photographic source, but the sunlight behind me is not. Now, for purposes of this class, we're really going to be dealing with ambient light sources or non-photographic light sources. Non-photographic light sources are ones that you have to adjust to as the photographer. You need to adjust to them as the photographer. You're not going to be able to control them because that's how we just defined it. You're not controlling this source. So I walk into an environment and I notice the ambient light sources in the room. And I'm going to notice if they have a lot of differences to them. In other words, is part of the room brighter than the other part? If we hold a camera and we point it this direction in this room, you're going to get differences. You're going to get the sunlight behind, through the window and out in the backyard, and the light that's lighting from this direction, which are two different amounts. You're going to find mixed lighting conditions like this in most environments that you walk into. It's not common to be shooting in a situation with extremely even light, though you will have that from time to time. Shooting out at a park on a very sunny and cloudless day. Shooting inside of a gym with just even fluorescent lights all the way layered through the top. These are even light sources. But more often than not, you're going to be dealing with mixed lighting sources. And if I want to make adjustments to my camera to expose the shot properly, then I need to know where is that light coming from relative to my subject and what my subject is. So I need to have some kind of system in my camera to start telling the camera what light I care about and what light I don't care about as it makes exposure decisions. This is going to be a system that we call metering, and it's the next thing we're going into. But please keep in mind, as we examine metering, what we're doing is telling the camera what light I care about and don't care about, because I've analyzed the situation and I've got some creative concept regarding the light source, its brightness, and its direction relative to a subject I've identified. So how do we do this? How do we tell the camera what light we care about and don't care about as we've noticed it in the environment relative to the subject that we have identified? How do we do that? Well, we use something called the metering mode, and the metering mode is going to be the system where the camera evaluates certain areas of the frame for light as it builds an exposure. And you have access to this in anything called a programmable mode. A programmable mode is really anything designated with a letter. These are going to be either P, A, S, and M, or for Canon users, P, AV, TV, and M. So the first one's program mode, and if that's where you're at, that's fine right now. That's fine. That's going to be our first step out of auto. And the second one is going to be A or AV. It stands for aperture priority, or Canon it stands for aperture value, AV. The third one is going to be shutter priority, shutter speed priority. That's going to be an S, or for Canon users it's labeled as a TV, same thing. And then M is for manual, where we're deciding everything together. And if you don't know what those terms, aperture and shutter, mean yet, that's fine. We're getting there. For right now, we are in a programmable mode that's not manual, because in any of those, the camera is going to be deciding the overall exposure, but we get to choose the metering mode. So let's take a look at that. The metering mode is the camera evaluating light. That's what it is. It's evaluating light. And we get to tell it what part of the frame we care about and what we don't as it builds an exposure. It comes out of the box in an evaluative metering mode, which is also an averaging metering mode. So it cares about all aspects of the frame identically, right? So the light outside the window would be as important as the light on my face. The upside is that there's very little variation or volatility in the exposure, shot for shot. In other words, if I'm taking several pictures in a row and the camera slightly shifts a little bit, and maybe I'm centered in one and slightly off center in another, you're not going to see that big of a change, because the overall part of the frame, the overall differences in the frame that are being metered is very small. We typically use an evaluative metering mode in landscape shooting, which is just great. because we do care about sky and ground pretty equally in those kinds of shots. But the main reason that it comes out of the box, the camera comes out of the box in an evaluative metering mode, is because there's less variation. I don't think this is a very good all-purpose metering system, personally. I think that you'd be better served with center-weighted metering. And the reason I say that is center-weighted metering is the way that we take most photographs. Center-weighted metering cares about the middle 25% of the frame disproportionately more than the surrounding 75%. Now, most pictures people take are of people. We tend to put them in the middle of the frame. So evaluating that light and telling the camera to ignore the light behind them is more useful for most circumstances. So that's going to be something that I think is useful more on a general purpose. It's better for portraits, it's better for macro shots, but you will see more variation because the percentage of the frame that's changing as I move the camera that's being metered is greater. The extreme, of course, would be if I metered only one particular spot in the frame. Now, shot for shot, I'd get a lot more variation, but I'd be much more accurate at that individual point. And that's what spot metering is. So now I'm extremely accurate at one point, but I've given up that stability and that consistency of exposure for right or for wrong. And that would be a particularly bad metering mode right now because I'm wearing a black shirt. So you could meter my skin tone and that would give an accurate exposure, but if the camera moved slightly down and that metering point was on my black shirt, immediately I would have a photograph that was going to be overexposed because now I was trying to expose for my black shirt. And then it's going to totally throw off the exposure. So evaluative, center-weighted, and spot are going to be the metering modes that we have to work with. And now let's go and put them into practice. So we understand that metering is going to be the way that the camera says what areas of the frame I care about and what areas of the frame I do not care about. And we know we can have something that evaluates the entirety of the frame, we can have something that evaluates the center of the frame, and we can have something that dictates just one single point. So let's actually put these into practice. I've had some example photographs, but also I want you to see this in practice as we go through. So I've got a shot set up here, and just a normal shot. We got some sky, we got some trees, we got some grass. And right now, let's change our shooting mode here. We're going to go to a programmable mode. So if I'm just changing metering, I can be in program, aperture priority, or shutter priority. And so it's giving me an exposure here of f5.6, 1/500th of a second, ISO of, it's an auto right now, so not sure what it's giving me there. If we don't know what those terms mean yet, that's okay, we're coming to that. But what I'm going to do is look at my metering mode. So let's take a look. Where do I have that programmed? Let's actually take a look inside of the menu here. And we're just going to find it. And we're going to look and find our metering mode. You'll have it in your menu. You're going to have it potentially metering mode. Okay. So you're going to have it in your quick menu. You'll have it as a button, or you'll of course have it in your entire full menu. So I've got a couple options inside of this camera that expand off of the ones that every camera has. So I've got something here that's multi-segmented, and if we take a look at the way that this looks, as I move the camera, you're seeing very little change in that overall exposure if I am in this multi-segmented metering mode. So that's just fine. So if I go and I shoot that photograph there, it's averaging the entire frame together. Okay, well that's just fine. The next one down is going to be my center-weighted metering mode. So this is going to look at the middle 25%. And what you're going to notice is that as I move the camera, I'm getting more fluctuation in the brightness that it's giving me than I had before. And you're seeing that shutter speed shift from an 800th of a second at the top end to about 1/320th on the bottom end. Again, if that you don't know what that means yet, that's okay. We're coming to that. Now let's take a look here. And I'm going to have a spot metering. And if I move this, we're going to see that fluctuate quite a bit. You can actually see the circle of where it's metering, right in the middle of the frame there. And you can see that actually doing all of its work. So we're getting more fluctuation off of that, and we're getting a 1/1000th of a second here, and we did not see that exposure when we were in center weighted. So this is going to give us an exact exposure, let's say, of that fence right there, and notice that makes the sky very bright. Whereas if I change this mode over to here, I'm getting a slightly different exposure, and it's trying to average that sky in. So we're getting different exposures as we work with this. Typically, we select a metering mode based on the situation we're going to be in. Landscape pictures like this tend to be in metering modes that are evaluative. Portraits tend to be in something that's center weighted. And tricky lighting conditions tend to be spot metering. Let's take our metering modes and examine how they work in different environments with different types of subjects and different lights, all right? And see how those really start working and when we would choose one versus another. So I've got my camera set up looking outside, and I'm looking just at the backyard, and I've got a perfectly good exposure. As we can see here, I'm shooting 1/500th of a second at 4.5 ISO 100. And if I change my metering mode, right now it's in a multi-segmented, which is an averaging, a weighted averaging. If I go to center weighted, there is no change. None. It looks the same. If I go to spot metering, it's the same again. All three of these are giving me the same exposure. Now, as a side note, you're going to notice that I have two metering modes in my camera that you may not have in yours. One is an exact mathematical averaged, and the other is metering for highlights rather than metering for midtones. Those two are beyond the scope of this class because they are not common to cameras. We're looking only at the first three. And the first three give me the same exposure. Now, why is that? Well, there's two reasons why. First, even light is hitting this area from front to back in my frame, meaning that it can average this shot together and get something that is really going to be easy to work with. The second is there's a lot of grass in the frame. Okay? Grass averages out to 18% gray if it was monochrome. So we can actually use it to build a proper exposure. Grass is amazingly useful for building a proper exposure outdoors. And since I've got a lot of grass, if I just look at the whole area of grass, or if I look at an average of it, then it's going to look pretty much the same. If I look at a spot metering of grass, it'll be the same again. But now let's take this exact same thing, and let's take the camera, and I'm going to point it inside here. I'm going to point it at this china cabinet. And I want to take a picture of this, and the plate's really what I want to have look accurate and correct. But this china cabinet is very dark wood. Very, very dark wood. Now, since it's a lot of area of the frame that is a dark tone, the camera believes that it's underexposed. But something being a darker tone, a black shirt, a dark wood china cabinet, and actually being underexposed or in shadow look the same to the camera, but are in fact two totally different things. So that means that this exposure of 1/60th of a second, f1.8 ISO 100 is not correct. It's too dark. Well, let's change our metering mode here. I'm going to change this to center weighted, and we should see that it changes almost immediately. So here's center weighted, and there's multi-segmented, and it drops. If I go to spot metering, it drops again. And it gives me, let me move this so you can actually kind of see here. If I go to spot metering, it gives me that little circle. I'm going to put that right over this plate, and now it's metering that plate accurately and saying that a proper exposure is now ISO 100 f2.5 at a 1/160th of a second. The scene hasn't changed, but what light the camera evaluates has. So now it's ignoring this darker table, and it's taking this plate and making it what it believes is a proper exposure. And it's pretty close. I would say it's a smidge too dark still. So let's see if center weighting is a little bit better. Center weighting is a little bit better. Now we're at 1/125th f2.2 at ISO 100. So three different exposures, exact same subject, just depending on what light I average and look at. So I have to examine the tone of the subject, the light in the space, how directional it is, to see if I'm being backlit or front lit or side lit, and know if I'm looking at something that would average out to a neutral tone. The more neutral tones, the easier the camera has of a time figuring out a proper exposure. So we can't just let the camera evaluate light for us and just do some kind of magic. We still need to be mentally engaged in order to get a proper exposure as we shoot. So here's why everything I just told you is wrong. We have been making adjustments to metering. We've been making adjustments to the way that the camera divides up the frame and what light it cares about and doesn't care about, and that's all nice as far as it goes. But it's been assuming that there are really only 3 ways that light can fall and shape your subject. And of course, that's just not reality. That's not true. There are an unlimited number of ways that light can hit and shape your subject. Secondly, what if the way that the camera creates an exposure for you is just not what you want? What if it's aesthetically not what you're going after? It's your art, after all. And you want to make it brighter or darker, or you want a silhouette. These are your decisions to make, but the camera can't make those kinds of creative decisions. Thirdly, there is actually a problem, there's actually several problems, with the way that the camera's metering system works. And I think the most important one is the 18% gray rule. Here's what it means in a nutshell. Your camera defines a proper exposure as one where all of the pixels average to 18% gray. And in case you wanted to know, this is what 18% gray looks like right here. That's it. So that's fine for some shots, but for some shots it's just not correct. What if you're taking a picture of the night sky? What if you're taking a picture of someone wearing a black shirt? What if you're taking a picture of an animal with white fur? All of these situations make the 18% gray rule incorrect. But there's no way to alter the fact that your camera defines a proper exposure by the 18% gray rule. The only thing you can do is make adjustments from that camera's starting point. So what we need next is a way of adjusting the exposure on the camera on a shot-for-shot basis in any situation where the camera is deciding the exposure, and that is any non-manual mode. So in program, aperture priority, and shutter priority, you are going to be telling the camera to make adjustments to its assumptions because it is still providing the end overall exposure. What we want then is something called exposure compensation, and that's what we're exploring next. So exposure compensation. This is the first tool that you have access to control the overall brightness of your shot on a picture-for-picture basis. Remember, we choose metering mode based on the overall environment, and then we leave it alone. And exposure compensation, we change picture-for-picture if we need to. We shouldn't have to change it that much, but we can if we want to. So what is exposure compensation? It's going to be a button or a dial that has a symbol that's a plus and a minus sign. And then you're going to see positive and negative values. And when you first use this, you're going to find a 0 in the middle. The 0 you can think of as 0 change from what the camera believes is correct, according to its 18% gray rule. So 0 change from the 18% gray rule. Okay, you have positive values and negative values. Positive values are going to be overexposed images or overexposed to what the camera believes is correct. Remember, maybe the camera is wrong according to the 18% gray rule, and overexposure from the camera's point of view is actually accurate, or it could be overexposure from the camera's point of view to make it aesthetically correct. Both are totally legitimate options. Negative values, of course, then would be darker images or underexposed relative to what the camera believes is correct. Okay, so positive values and negative values. You're also going to notice that you have these in basically a small notch, and then a full numerical value, then a small notch, and then another full numerical value. In other words, it'll be 0, notch, notch, 1, notch, notch, 2 on the positive and negative side. This is the first introduction you have to what is known as the stop system. Light is measured in photography in what we call stops. This is the unit of measurement of light, and it effectively means twice as much or half as much. So if a light source is one stop brighter than another, it is twice as powerful on the subject. Okay? And if I have shutter speed, for instance, that goes one stop faster, it lets in half as much light as the previous value. We're going to be exploring that as we talk about shutter, aperture, and ISO. For right now, we are introduced to the idea of the stop system in third stop increments. That's why there are 3. The first notch is going to be 1/3 of a stop, second one is 2/3 of a stop, and then we get a whole value. That's a 1. Then notch, notch 2, so it's going to be 1 1/3, 1 2/3, and then 2 stops on either direction. Remember this information. It's not initially useful. We don't think stops when we're just controlling exposure compensation, but when we translate this into working with aperture and with shutter and ISO, understanding the stop system becomes very important. So, initially we're going to be shooting pictures. It's fine if we're still in program mode, and we're going to be able to go and start moving exposure compensation in positive and negative ways in order to produce the image that we want. And now we're going to put that into practice. So, we understand that the metering mode is something I'm going to set for a situation. I really don't touch it very much after that one initial setup, but I might change brightness on a picture-for-picture basis if I feel it's necessary. So what can I do there? I need exposure compensation, and we're going to take a look at how that works mechanically right now. So I've got this same picture that I had for the metering segment of the tree and the fence in the backyard, and I want you to see this at play. So I've got exposure compensation. We're just going to open it up inside of the menu here so you can see it. And notice that I've got 0 in the middle. I've got positive values and negative values. If I go over to the positive values, the whole frame is going to get brighter. If I go over to negative values, the whole frame is going to get darker. And so that's going to allow me on the fly to adjust the brightness. Remember, the camera can be wrong. The camera is fallible. And this is also done, as you're seeing, in the stop system. So I have a 0, 0.3, 0.7, and a 1. This is 1/3, 2/3, and then a full stop. 1/3, 2/3, and then to the second stop. So if I want to go one stop brighter, I know it's 3 clicks and I'm one stop brighter. If I go back to 0, I do 3 clicks underexposed or counterclockwise, then I'm going to get one stop underexposed in the exposure. Okay? Now, what it's mechanically doing here is it is moving pieces of the exposure compensation or the exposure triangle, right? So it's using the pieces of the exposure triangle, which we have not started talking about yet, in order to change this overall exposure. So that means we use it in program mode, aperture priority, and shutter priority, okay? Now we haven't talked about the actual ISO, shutter speed, and aperture yet, so I'm not talking about how this is operating, just right now that it operates, that I can go into positive and negative values and change the overall exposure as I want to. We're going to use these in every programmable non-manual mode. But right now, I want to do a kind of a practical test and work with this in an actual shoot outside of just this backyard. Let's go ahead and put this into practice, and we've got a really good opportunity to do so. Right outside, there's some snow on the ground, so we're going to take a look here. We've got this branch, we've got snow behind it as the background. And remember what we said about the exposure compensation system. It's going to want to take white and turn it into gray. So right now we're looking at this scene, and that white is polluting a correct exposure. It's taking it and pulling it darker. We've got an underexposed branch, and the snow isn't really pure white the way it should be. So we're going to take our exposure compensation, And we're going to take it here. This is 0. And let's bring it up. That's one stop brighter. And we can see that the detail on the branch better. That histogram has moved over to the right side. The spike is now over in the pure white kind of area, which is where it should be. And that's a much better exposure. So +1 exposure compensation gave us a proper exposure in this situation. Now let's go ahead and take this camera and let's point it inside. And I'm going to point it at this little section here. And obviously we're still at +1 exposure compensation. That's way too bright. So we're going to take that down to 0. And 0 is fine, but that wood paneling is actually supposed to be kind of dark. So I would say that this is still overexposed. So we're going to take that exposure compensation, and that's right there's 2/3 of the stop underexposed. And I would say that that is far more accurate. What we're seeing there is giving us the true color of the wood, the true color of the background wall, and the true color of the vases. So negative exposure compensation in here with this darker object and positive exposure compensation outside with the snow were necessary to give us the exposures we were looking for. So what is the camera actually doing? We've given the camera control in program, aperture priority, and shutter priority modes for making exposure decisions. It is giving us a brightness of the shot. It's providing that, and we can alter it with exposure compensation, but it's doing something to give us brighter or darker pictures. What it's actually doing is manipulating the 3 aspects of the exposure triangle. The exposure triangle are the 3 controls the camera has over light. And they have really never changed. And we see no reason why they ever would change. The first one is going to have something to do with our sensitivity to light. We actually have control over the sensitivity to light. And let's describe kind of how that works in essence. Let's imagine that we need a certain brightness level on a subject. We need the image to be of a certain brightness, but there's less light than we would ideally like. So some amount of light is hitting the subject, but then we can increase our sensitivity to it to make up for the light we don't have. In other words, light will either be hitting the subject or we can invent it. Now, if we invent light, there are consequences, and that's going to be the noise of the photograph, what we call the grain of the photograph. In other words, by increasing our sensitivity, we are degrading our image quality, and different cameras will degrade to different amounts. So that's going to be a difference for you and for your camera. But let's describe some basics of how this works. Let's say we walk into a room and there's no windows, there are no overhead lights, there are only 256 candles. And for the moment, ignore the blatant fire hazard. So there are 256 candles. We're taking a picture inside of this room, and then we blow out half of them. Now we have 128 candles. The camera needs to basically invent the other 128. Makes them up as if they weren't there in terms of its sensitivity to light. It doubles its sensitivity as the amount of light drops. Let's say we blow out another half. We're down to 64 candles. It doubles its sensitivity yet again. If we blow out another half, we're down to 32 candles. We have to double our sensitivity yet again. So doubling, of course, is something that's not numerically tied. From 2 to 4 is doubling the same way that 128 to 256 is doubling. And as I do this, I'm increasing the amount of noise generated by the camera. So that's going to be our theory that's going to underpin ISO. As we make ISO decisions, we are inventing light and degrading the image in order to do so. However, there are some situations when we just don't have a choice. If we don't increase our ISO, we are going to have images that are either too dark or too blurry. Now, why too blurry? We're going to talk about this more as we get into our shutter speed section, which is in a couple sections further in the course. But we use ISO as an artificial way of increasing our shutter speed. And when we get to our practical demonstration in just a couple lectures here, you're going to see that ISO is a direct changer and a direct effect on our shutter speed. But let's take a look at how we actually utilize it. The first corner of our exposure triangle is going to be our ISO. This is our sensitivity to light. Now this is measured using the stop system that we initially introduced when we were talking about exposure compensation. So right now I've got my camera set in a manual exposure mode because I want you to notice something, that the exposure compensation is giving me kind of a negative value there, and I'm in ISO 200. So watch what happens here. If I take my ISO and I bring it up to 500, notice I'm getting positive values. If I take this lower, then it starts giving me negative values. So it's telling me when it thinks that I'm correct. All right. So right about there, I'm one stop overexposed. 1, 2, 3 clicks, and I should be properly exposed. 1, 2, 3 clicks. I should be about, right around there is going to be one stop underexposed. So the ISO is going to give us some control over exposure compensation, and it's going to give us control over exposure. I want you to notice the values. Let me take this all the way down. So here's 100 ISO. This is a low ISO value. So 100 is a low ISO value, which means it's darker. As I take ISO and I bring it up brighter, there's 200, that's a stop brighter. 1, 2, 3 clicks. There's 400, that's a stop brighter still. 1, 2, 3 clicks. I'm at ISO 800, so that's another stop brighter still. And we notice that I'm getting this much brighter photograph at 800 than I was at 100, right about there. So low values numerically are going to be darker images. High values numerically are going to be brighter images, and it's in third stop increments, and the numbers double with every stop. So notice 100, one stop brighter is going to be 200. One stop brighter than that is going to be 400. One stop brighter than that's going to be 800, and you could take that all the way up the line, right? There are cameras right now that are able to shoot as high as, I believe the current record is around 4 million ISO. So these values just keep doubling, all right? Your lowest ISO is going to be what's called your native ISO, which is what the camera actually is sensitive to. Everything else is where we boost that signal. So we take that basic ISO 100 and we boost it in order to get to 200, and that's where your noise comes from. So when we're going to do a practical shoot here in a minute, we're going to change ISO, we're going to examine noise, but we're also going to see how this changes my brightness. So I'm going to get out of manual, I'm going to go over to program mode, and I want you to notice something. I'm in basic program. So if I want to change metering, exposure compensation, and ISO, I could be in basic program mode. Watch what happens. I'm going to take my ISO and I'm going to start changing it. ISO 100, I'm getting a 400th of a second. Watch what happens there. I go to 200, and now I'm at an 800th of a second. 1, 2, 3 clicks, I'm at ISO 400, I'm at 1600th of a second. Notice that the camera in program mode, as I change ISO, has to change something else, and the overall brightness of the frame isn't changing. You see that? I'm changing it up and down, ISO, but the actual brightness of the frame doesn't change. Why? Because my metering mode hasn't changed. If I'm in program mode, the metering mode gives me the overall brightness. If I change one part of the triangle, then another part must compensate to give me the same brightness. That will be true in program, aperture priority, and shutter priority. The only time it's not true is in manual, where we began this lecture. So if I change ISO in a programmable mode, that will not change brightness, as we can see right now. But now I want to take this and I want to see how it affects the images that I produce.
I decided that instead of a practical demonstration, again, of changing your ISO value and arriving at a different aperture or shutter or seeing how that changes brightness, I wanted to show what changing ISO does to image quality. So I have 3 images here, 3 of them, and each of these 3 is shot at a different ISO value. So let's take a look at them. I'm going to click on this first one. This is the landscape image. And if I look at my data, here it tells me this was shot at an ISO of 320, relatively low. This next one here was shot indoors, and this was shot at an ISO of 4000. And this last one, shot outside, was at ISO 640. So let's take a look at each one of these and the decisions behind them. And I want to start with this one at ISO 4000. So if I take this and I look at this image at 100%, then I can see that I'm losing information. I've got this noise that's appearing here. I'm losing information in the face, which is a loss of detail, as well as these kind of dots of color that weren't actually there. So it's both things that are happening. You can really see it in this corner here. Now, why did I decide to shoot this at ISO 4000? Well, the reality is I was shooting pictures of my son indoors, and he's moving, but it's very low light. So the only thing that I can really do after opening my aperture to f2.8 and deciding on a shutter speed that's necessary for his movements, even though I'm still getting some motion blur, as we can see, the only thing to do is to raise the ISO. So let's take this next shot. And this was outdoors, and so there was a lot of light, but I needed a relatively fast shutter speed, 1/1600th of a second. And the reason I did was for the action. This was a shot of my son coming down a slide, and it's part of a sequence. Well, I needed that to be a fast enough shutter speed that if I took a look at his hair, it'd be standing on end in the breeze. Now, if I look at this, at this lower ISO, it still is quite reasonable. I have a little bit of noise happening, but not nearly as much in the background, not nearly as much on his face. And if I look at his hoodie, there's plenty of detail all the way through it. So that's a better result. Here I have a landscape picture that did not need any particularly fast shutter speed. I wanted it to be of an appropriate value, because I was shooting with an f4 lens, so I couldn't open up any brighter. But if I take a look at this background, I have no discernible noise at ISO 320 anywhere inside of the frame. And I wanted a shutter speed that was fast enough to capture these droplets of rain as they were coming down. But if I look at the whole frame, it's completely clean of noise. And because I didn't need a shutter speed any faster than 1/60th of a second, ISO 320 was perfect. Had I had a lens with me that could have opened to a brighter aperture, I could have opened that ISO and shot at 100 or 200, but I was perfectly happy with my capabilities, or my camera's capabilities, at this particular ISO. So hopefully that explains what your consequence is when you raise your ISO and the reasons that you make different ISO decisions.
We're deep into the middle of understanding our exposure triangle, and at this point we want to discuss the aperture in the triangle. And the aperture is a description of how much light the lens allows through and into the exposure. So if our triangle corners are our ISO, which describes our sensitivity to light, and our shutter speed, which describes how long we use it for, then the aperture describes how much light we have to work with. And as I will discuss throughout this section, I believe the aperture is the most important corner to understand properly. More on that later, but for right now, let's examine what we can figure out about aperture. We know that this is a lens attribute, so you might expect that different lenses might have different apertures, and you are exactly correct in that assumption. In fact, one of the major buying decisions we make regarding a lens is how much light it allows in, which we call its maximum aperture. We don't really describe a lens by its minimum aperture. And there's a couple reasons why we don't. The first is that there are not that many values that lenses tend to close down to, which we describe as stopping down to. So there's not that much variety. Another reason we don't describe lenses by their minimum aperture is that's not where the money is in the lens. We pay more for a lens that allows in more light, but we don't pay more for a lens if it closes down or stops down to one particular aperture versus another. You'll see lenses that close down to numbers like f16 for some, f22 for most, and sometimes beyond that to f29 or f32 for others. If you don't know what those numbers mean yet, that's okay. We're going to be talking about it. For right now, we know that the aperture describes an amount of light coming in through the lens. So why might we change this aperture value? There's two main reasons why we might do so. The first has to do with a practical consideration. If there is too much light in an environment, if I close down or stop down my lens, then I will have less light effectively to work with, and that will allow me to build a proper exposure. The converse is true as well. If I'm in an environment with very low light and I have a lens that can compensate by opening up and allowing more light in, I can still achieve a proper exposure. This is the reason why lenses for indoor sports photography are very specific lenses. They need to be both telephoto in their focal length and bright in their aperture. By the way, a bright lens describes a lens that allows in a lot of light at its maximum aperture. We would also call this a fast lens because if a lens allows in more light, I can shoot at a faster shutter speed. So a fast lens or a bright lens describe the same thing, which is a bright maximum aperture. Now, one thing that people mistake when they're talking about aperture is they think that just because I describe a lens's maximum aperture, that is the only one it can shoot at. But as we are going to discover, that's not in any way true. I can choose a range of values as this series of blades closes down or opens back up. The second reason why I might choose one aperture value versus another is depth of field. As I close my aperture or stop down my aperture, what I am doing for creative purposes is stretching what we call the depth of field. Now, the depth of field is the distance in front of and behind a subject that is in focus when the subject is in focus. So if I focus properly on a subject and I see a decent amount behind and in front of that subject also in focus, that is a longer depth of field. If, on the other hand, I have a very blurry background, or even sometimes part of a subject in focus and part of that same subject out of focus, this is what we refer to as a shallow depth of field. Now, how do I choose this? If I open up my aperture, allow in more light, then I have a shallower depth of field. If I stop down my aperture, my lens is effectively squinting, and at that point, I am stretching my depth of field, and more distance in front of and behind my subject will effectively be in focus as well. So we might choose an aperture value based solely on the amount of light in an environment, or we might choose it because we want a particular amount of the frame to also be in focus as well as our subject. We will be discussing focusing later on in the course, but one thing I want to make clear at this point is that the focus of a camera describes the exact point, or distance rather, where subjects are in focus. Everything else that is also in focus in the frame is not because of the focusing system, but because of depth of field. So aperture is really important to understand. What we're going to be doing first is we are going to take our camera outside and we're going to change aperture values and understand the numbering system, because this is the part that confuses people the most. And then we're going to take our camera and we're going to go and do some shooting and change our aperture value and see how it changes our depth of field. So let's get going. Let's put aperture into practice. Now, I argue that aperture is the most important single corner of the exposure triangle. Why? Because in any normal shooting situation, it's useful, just as shutter speed and ISO are going to be. But if I'm shooting portraiture, particularly studio lighting portraiture, or if I'm shooting video, then we stop thinking about shutter speed. We, by and large, stop thinking about ISO, but aperture never stops being important. So let's take a look at the way this breaks down. Let's take a look at where the values come from and start to get comfortable with the numerical system behind them, because that's the part that trips people up initially. To be able to choose aperture, you must be in aperture priority mode or in fully manual. So we're going to do this lecture in aperture priority mode. Eventually, we're going to be changing this in manual. But right now I'm in aperture priority mode. I have that same scene of the fence and the tree that I had from before. And right now you're noticing that it says f9. So 1/160th of a second, f9, ISO 100. If I take my exposure wheel and I move it, I start changing that aperture value. f4, over here it's f5.6, over here it's f8, and this particular lens will go to f22. So I can choose any value between f4 and f22. Additionally, this is going to be measured in the stop system. So I know it's 3 clicks. So I'm here at f4, and 1, 2, 3 clicks is f5.6. So I know that 5.6 is 1 stop different from f4. 1, 2, 3 clicks gives me f8.0. We just say f8. 1, 2, 3 clicks gives me f11. 1, 2, 3 clicks gives me f16, and 1, 2, 3 clicks gives me f22. Now, those are going to be my numerical values. We don't really know anything about them yet, but we know that those are them, and I can find them by just moving in third stop increments. I also know that these are doubling and halving values from each other. Just as in ISO, ISO 100 was half as sensitive to light as ISO 200, and ISO 400 was twice as sensitive to light as ISO 200. I'm then going to know that something about f4 is twice a value different from f5.6. Now, let's actually take a look at this. I'm going to switch exposure modes to manual here, and we're going to take a look at this. I'm in f4 right now, and remember that's the end of my aperture. I can't change in one direction, I can change in the other. If I go one stop to f5.6, the frame just got darker. So f4 is a brighter aperture value than f5.6. If I do another stop, that's f8, I'm one stop darker still. So f4 is the brightest aperture this particular lens can shoot. If this was an f2 lens, it would be brighter still. f2.8 would be halfway in the middle. So if I go all the way to f22, I get a totally dark frame. I can see a little bit of the outline of the tree here. So if I change my aperture, I know that larger numerical values indicate a darker image. f4 will be brighter, f5.6 is going to be darker, one stop darker, which is half as bright. f8, one stop darker still, which is half as much light again. Okay, let's go back to aperture priority. So I'm in aperture priority, and I've got my ISO, and I've set it to ISO 100. And now watch what happens here. If I'm shooting, I've got f4, ISO 100, and 1/800th of a second. If I go to f5.6, my shutter speed just dropped to 1/400th. If I go to f8, then it's going to drop to 200th. How much do you want to bet? If I go to f11, my shutter speed will be 100. Why? Because a stop of shutter speed and a stop of aperture and a stop of ISO are all the same amount of light. And since I've locked my ISO at a value and I've changed my aperture, the only thing that can move to compensate must be shutter speed. Now the shutter speed is going to be dictated by the exposure compensation and the metering mode that we have set, but it's going to respond exactly to the aperture as I move it. So I can move my aperture to change my brightness value. I do it in a stop system. We know something about the numerical system as well. We know that smaller numbers indicate more light. Now, we can also get an idea of what number we should be looking for. I've got f4, and then the next value is f5.6. The next aperture value darker is f8, which is, of course, twice the numerical value of f4. Twice the numerical value of f5.6 would technically be 11.2, but we round it and it's f11. The next one should be f16. Why? Because it's 8 times 2. 1, 2, 3, I'm at f16. The next one should be f22, right? The next one beyond that should be f32. This lens can't go to f32, but that would be the next darker aperture because 16 times 2 is 32. Beyond that, it's going to be f44. Now, this lens opens up only as bright as f4. The next brighter aperture is f2.8 because it's half of f5.6. And the next brighter aperture after that is f2 because it's 4 divided by 2. So if I know any two of the major apertures next to each other, I can extrapolate out the entire chart, just knowing that we cheat f5.6 to f11. Now, notice there are values in between, f4, f4.5, f5, and then 5.6. These are third stop increments. I don't have any sort of a tendency of memorizing the third stop increments. Some of them I see and I use often enough that I have memorized them by accident. So while I would say that it's very valuable to memorize the major apertures, knowing the third stop increments is not nearly as important. Now we also know, because we have that little detour talking about lenses and depth of field, that as I change aperture, I am changing my depth of field. So let's go and put that into practice. Right now is a good time for us to stop and to take a look at lenses and to take a look at depth of field. We're trying to understand depth of field as we understand aperture more fully. And to do that really effectively, we need to talk about its creative component, which is its effect over depth of field. But let's talk about what that means, and let's talk about understanding lenses in general. So far, we've just been using whatever lens we have without really discussing anything about it. But now it's time to change all of that. So first, I want to talk about lenses and understanding them a little bit. So the lens that I have here is a 24 to 70 f4. So let's talk about what that means. 24 to 70 is what's called its focal range. Each one of those points inside of it, 24, 25, 26, etc., is a focal length. So what does that mean? We have our lens, and we know, take the caps off of it here, the light's going to move in through the front of it and then out through the back of it, of course. So what happens there is that light comes in from all these directions and it converges together. So light converges together. There's a point where that converging light meets and then starts to spread out the other direction. That convergent point, from that point to the imaging sensor, which is called the focal plane, that distance is the focal length. All right? When focus is set to infinity. So that means that if I have 70 millimeter, I'm pushing that point farther away from the sensor. So the focal length is telling me something about the size of the lens lengthwise, which is why my 24 to 70 is a different size than my 70 to 200. All right, the f4, of course, is our aperture. Now, let's talk about that. If the lens just says f4, that means I can hit f4 anywhere throughout the range. So if I have a 24 to 70 f4, from 24 millimeter to 70 millimeter, I can achieve an f4 as my brightest aperture. The mistake a lot of people make is if you tell them this lens is an 85 millimeter 1.8 or that lens is a 24 to 70 f4, they think that that is the only aperture you can achieve, when in fact that is the brightest aperture you can achieve. We always discuss and describe lenses by what we call their maximum aperture. The maximum aperture is the maximum amount of light that they can allow in. There is nothing stopping a lens that can open to f1.8 from closing down, which we call stopping down, to f16 or f22. There's nothing stopping it whatsoever. So why don't we describe the aperture range in the way that we describe the focal range? Well, there's a couple reasons. The first is it doesn't differentiate things very much. You can have a $500 lens and a $5,000 lens, and their minimum aperture, the least amount of light they can let in, might be the same, perhaps f22. Most lenses in the world stop down to only one of a couple apertures. f16 is somewhat common, f22 is the most common, and every now and then you'll see f29. There are a couple other minimum apertures out there, but they're far more rare. So it doesn't differentiate very much, so it's not communicative. And the other reason why we don't describe lenses by minimum aperture is that's not where the money is. The money in the lens is in a couple things: the glass quality, the construction quality, of course, but the maximum aperture. The maximum aperture very much does change the properties of a lens and the cost of a lens. So we're going to describe lenses by its maximum aperture so that consumers know what they're buying. Minimum aperture doesn't do that. It doesn't communicate anything. So if I have a lens that is going to say just f4, I can hit f4 or f2.8 or whatever the description is at any point in the range. But what if there's multiple numbers listed? In other words, what if I have a lens and as it zooms, it changes maximum aperture? This will be described as for instance, an f3.5-5.6. It'll list two apertures. We call this an aperture variable lens. So the most common aperture variable lens in the world is the 18-55, 3.5 to 5.6, meaning that as you zoom from 18 millimeter to 55 millimeter, you lose maximum aperture. You can hit f3.5 at 18 millimeter, but at 55 millimeter, you can only hit f5.6 or dimmer. Now, why do manufacturers make lenses that are aperture variable? Well, there's only a couple reasons. They do make them smaller, they make them lighter, they make them cheaper. And those are all good things. So aperture variable lenses is something that we all own at some point in our lives. Some people stick with them because they give you greater range or greater cost benefits. The video right now is being shot on an aperture variable lens, in fact. And some people want to move into non-aperture variable lenses because they can hit the exact same exposure no matter how they frame their shot. So this is a 24-70 f4. The lens that I have here is an 85 millimeter, which means that this lens is a zoom lens and this lens is a non-zooming lens. When people say zoom lens, they oftentimes mean only telephoto zoom, when in fact photographers say zoom lens for any lens that has multiple focal lengths. A lens that does not zoom we call a prime, or a single focal length lens, though prime is just easier to say. So this is an 85 millimeter f1.8. Now, how does all of this affect depth of field? Right? We understand a little bit about lenses, we understand a little bit about size, we understand a little bit about cost, though construction and glass is of course going to be part of that. But let's talk a little bit more about depth of field. We know that aperture is going to be a major factor over depth of field. As I close down, which we call stopping down, remember, if I stop down my aperture, I will increase my depth of field. I'll have more in front of and behind the subject that is in focus when the subject is in focus. What else affects depth of field? Well, there's going to be two more factors that you have control over. The first is going to be the focal length you shoot at. Telephoto lenses have shallower depth of field than wide-angle lenses. So this 85 millimeter 1.8 and this 55 millimeter 1.8 have the same maximum aperture, but they have different inherent depths of field because this one is a wider angle than this one. So this one's going to be shallower. The other is going to be proximity. The physically closer I get to a subject, the shallower my depth of field becomes. This is why macro images have such shallow depth of field where not even a full flower is in focus. And yet a landscape image, it's very easy to produce something with a long range of focus, even if you didn't stop down the aperture very much. So a lot of good landscape images do not have to be shot at f22. They can be shot at f8 because I shoot wide enough that everything is in focus. So that's how we can manipulate depth of field. Two aspects are going to be shooting technique, and a third one is going to be the aperture and the lens itself. So I hope that describes a little bit about lenses, describes a little bit about what kind of lenses produce the images you want to work with, and how you can shoot to get the effects that you want. Let's take a look at working with our aperture. Now we've got a scene here where we have a pole that's closer to us and a building farther away. We're going to focus on the pole. So watch what happens. I'm going to take my aperture here and I'm going to open it up to f4. And if I focus on that pole and shoot a picture and we review it, look at the word sandwiches back here. Pole's in focus. But if I come up to this background, of course, it's out of focus. We're going to change nothing except the aperture. We're going to take it, we're going to close it down. So this is going to be about f16 here. Shoot another picture. And if we go in to our background, of course the pole is still in focus, but if I take a look at this background, lots of detail all the way through it. So as we discussed, there are several ways of controlling depth of field. But when we're working with our aperture, we can go into aperture priority mode, as we just did, change the aperture, f4 being a more open value, f16 be a more closed down value, and totally change the look and feel of the image. So we're doing well. We understand our ISO as something that controls image quality to a certain extent, but also controls the sensitivity to light of our shoot. We understand aperture. We know it opens and closes inside of the lens and controls how much light comes in to the camera as we make an exposure, but also controls depth of field because of where the light is coming from. The last part of our exposure triangle is going to be shutter speed, or as I like to talk about it for purposes of education, shutter duration, though that's not a term you're going to hear elsewhere. So if ISO are going to be our sensitivity, aperture is how much light, shutter speed is how long we use it for. So we're creating a single image, but we can gather light for that image for as long as we really want. There are 6-hour exposures out there and they look pretty cool. So how do we do this? How do we understand shutter speed? Well, you have a mechanism in your camera that's going to open and close, and that is going to allow light in to expose the photograph. The period of time it's open, we call shutter speed. Now, I like to say shutter duration for pedagogical purposes because the shutter speed terminology makes people think it has to do with how fast the camera operates, and that's not true at all. It has to do with how long we expose the photograph. So it's shutter duration for purposes of teaching. Now, I'm producing one single image. I'm not producing a series, right? We're not talking video. We're just talking about this single image that we are producing. And if I'm producing a single image, then I'm compressing time into one moment. And let's explore that for a second, because this is going to matter. We will make shutter speed decisions based on how much light we have to work with, absolutely, because it's a control over exposure, but we also make it based on the possibility of blur. We also make these decisions based on the possibility of blur. So if I'm shooting for a 1/60th of a second, let's say, then I am taking every moment, everything that happened during that 1/60th of a second, and presenting it all onto the sensor, and it's going to show as if all of that motion and action happened simultaneously. Does that make sense? We're going to take everything that happens during this period of time, and we're going to compress it so that it looks as if it all happened simultaneously. And all moments are treated equally. They're all treated equally important because they're all being lit equally. When we get into flash exposures, not all moments are treated equally because some of them are lit brighter than others. But for right now, they're all treated equally. So that is the understanding of how motion blur happens. So the shorter the period of time, the less motion can happen, and therefore less motion blur will take effect. Faster shutter speeds, less motion blur. But I also want to explore what happens with longer ones. Let's say that you're taking a picture of somebody who's running across, let's say, a field or backyard or something like that. If I am fast enough, I'm going to get crisp motion of them running. If I'm slower, I'm going to get motion blur. As I go slower, they'll be blurred for longer and longer and longer streaks throughout that backyard. But as the exposure is longer and they're running through the frame at the same speed, they will be lit less than the surrounding area than at any one moment. So they will get dimmer and dimmer throughout the frame until eventually they will disappear entirely. If you do a nighttime shot and do a 10-second exposure, you can start it, literally walk in front of your camera, and you will not show up in the final image. You're just not lit enough at any one point through the frame for long enough to matter. I'm going to show you some pictures of shooting downtown at night, and you're going to see headlights and taillights, which are light sources, but you won't see the cars associated with them. In fact, you'll see right through where they were and see the background. Why? Those cars were not lit enough for that long a period of time as they drove through to show up. The same thing would be true of somebody standing around downtown and maybe walking through the frame. The same thing would be true if you shot a long enough photograph of a heavily visited area. If you shot for long enough, eventually everybody would just vanish. So there are some fun things to explore in shutter speed. But right now, let's take a look at how we utilize this important mechanism. This is a good moment for us to stop for a second and take a look a little bit more at just the way that the stop system works in general and the way we describe it. The stop system is the way we analyze both the mechanisms that we work with in photography, the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO. We measure their control over light in the same unit of measurement. It's also how we describe light sources as they hit a subject. So we use this system for a lot of different purposes in photography. As we've examined, ISO, aperture, and shutter speed control light in the stop system, which in brief is twice as much or half as much. In other words, if I change one part of my exposure triangle by one stop, I am allowing in either twice or half as much light as I did with the previous value. So this makes the most sense in the world of shutter speed. It makes sense that 1/30th of a second lets in twice as much light as 1/60th of a second. So we would say that 1/30th of a second is one stop brighter than 1/60th. 1/60th of a second then is one stop brighter than 1/125th of a second. The same thing is true in ISO. ISO 200 is twice as bright of an exposure, twice as bright of part of the exposure triangle as ISO 100. So it pretends there's twice as much light as there actually is. ISO 400 pretends there's twice as much yet again, and we can move up that ladder nearly as far as we want. I believe the top ISO producing camera in the world has a top ISO of over 4 million at the moment. And that number is sure to go up over time. Aperture is the same way. f4 lets in twice as much light as f5.6. f5.6 lets in twice as much light as f8. So it's twice as much and half as much. Since we're measuring in the same unit of measurement, if I opened my shutter speed from 1/60th of a second to 1/30th of a second and then closed my aperture from f5.6 to f8, I would have the same overall brightness in my photograph. Same overall brightness. Now, the shutter speed is slower, so there's more motion blur, and the aperture is more closed down, so there's more depth of field. The creative aspects have changed, but the brightness of the frame have not. If we take a look at an image, we take a look at the histogram, and we say that looks like it's two stops underexposed, then we need to find two stops of light somewhere. And for overall purposes of brightness, it doesn't matter where you get them. Open your aperture, slow your shutter speed, increase your ISO. All of these are legitimate options for making the overall brightness of the frame brighter. But each of them has consequences. The shutter speed will show more motion blur, the aperture will have shallower depth of field, and we will be degrading the image quality through the ISO. So we have to be careful in how we make exposure triangle stop-based decisions. And we always come back to our creative intention. If we are shooting a landscape scene and we want it to be brighter, I'm not going to accomplish that by opening my aperture. Why? Because the aperture is creatively important to the landscape shot. Instead, I need to slow my shutter speed, which is why so many landscape photographs are shot on tripods. We need to close down the aperture for the creativity of the shot to work. Notice we made the creative decision before the practical decision. If we don't make the creative decision first, we have no basis on which to found our practical decisions. Let's say that we're shooting indoor sports. I need a creative shutter speed that's faster. Now that's going to lose light, and we're already in a low light environment. So I need a bright aperture lens, and I'm going to need to increase my ISO. Those two are working to serve the creative decision, and we made the creative decision first. So we make a decision about what the frame needs to be. One corner of the triangle becomes that which is creatively important to the shot we want to get, and the other two aspects work to serve it. I stress this as I talk manual exposure, but it's true no matter what. There is an exposure triangle for any shot that you take, independent of how you get there. We just have more control over it when we shoot manually. Now, we also describe light sources in terms of their brightness. When we talk about a flash or the studio lights, the video lights that are hitting me right now, we say that that light source is an f8. And if I want to take a light source and make it twice as bright, I am making it one stop brighter, which would then allow me to close down my aperture or to lower my ISO. So you can see that light sources need to get extremely bright just to have 1 or 2 or 3 stops difference between them, which is a big concern in the world of lighting. So we can talk about the overall brightness of the frame in the stop system. We could talk about our exposure triangle and our creative controls in terms of the stop system. And if you ever take lighting courses, then we start talking about light sources in terms of the stop system, which is a little bit beyond what we're trying to do in this particular course. So the stop system is important for understanding making manual exposure decisions, understanding working with exposure compensation, really the foundations of making intelligent decisions in photography. With that, let's get back to some actual shooting. So we're doing really well. We understand ISO, we understand aperture, we understand the stop system, and that each part of the exposure triangle is measured using the stop system. We understand that one stop in ISO for brightness purposes is exactly the same as one stop in aperture or in shutter speed. So we're going to examine shutter speed right now, and we're going to learn a little bit about working with it. And I want you to notice a couple things here. So I'm in shutter priority mode. If you want to be able to select shutter speed, you must be in either shutter priority or fully manual. We're going to start in shutter priority here, and I'm going to select, this is ISO, let's say 100, it's a bright day. I'm at a 1/125th of a second shutter speed at f9, and we're seeing that there. Now we know that since I'm not in manual, the camera is dictating the overall brightness using the metering mode and the exposure compensation. So if I change shutter speed, the brightness of the frame is not changing as I move it. But I know that then the aperture must change because ISO has been set. It's not in auto. So shutter speed will change the aperture to produce the same brightness. Okay, let's put that to the test. I'm at 1/125th. Now, one stop darker is going to be 1/250th of a second. That makes sense. The 1/250th of a second, since it's half the period of time, is going to be one stop darker. Notice if I go to 1/250th, the aperture has dropped to f6.3. Before, it was at f9. So I'm opening up the aperture to compensate for the faster shutter speed. Now I have an f4 lens on here. If I move this exposure all the way to, let's say, a 1/1000th of a second, notice the aperture starts blinking. Why? There are more shutter speed values to choose from than there are aperture values. Because of that, it is completely possible to select a shutter speed that has no corresponding aperture. But I'm in shutter priority mode. I can select whatever I want. If there is a shutter speed that has no corresponding aperture, the picture must get darker. And watch what happens. I'm at 1/1000th, this is 1/2000th, and the picture is getting darker as I do this. It's blinking the aperture to tell me there is no corresponding aperture to go along, and it must get darker because it has nothing it can do. Now, if the ISO is set to auto, it would compensate by bringing up the ISO. That makes sense. So I can choose a value that has no corresponding aperture and the picture will get darker. This really doesn't happen in aperture priority. Because of this, I believe aperture priority is easier for new photographers to shoot in than shutter priority. So we know that this is also in the stop system. One stop brighter than 1/2000th of a second should be 1/1000th, and below that should be 1/500th, and then it should be 1/250th, 1/125th, and then we cheat a little bit and go to 1/60th of a second, 30th, 15th, we cheat again and go to 1/8th of a second for 2 full seconds, and then we start getting larger. In fact, the longest exposure you can manually select in a camera historically is 30 full seconds, and the shortest, if I go the other direction, is going to be 1/8000th. There's a lot of values in between there, which means that there are a lot of places where there's no corresponding aperture. Now, if I want to make sure that I can handhold a shot, what shutter speed do I actually need? And there's a good old rule of thumb for this that still holds true, and that is to be able to handhold a shot, your focal length should be your shutter speed, or your shutter speed should be faster than that. Now I'm shooting at 70mm on a 24-70 lens, so I'm at 1/250th of a second at the moment, and I know I can handhold that. But if I go all the way to 60th, I'm not 100% certain that I could. Yes, there are stabilized lenses out there, and those are going to help, but please note that you are relying on your stabilization as soon as your shutter speed is slower than your focal length number. Okay? So there is no 70mm, meaning that the next one is 1/80th of a second. I am fairly confident that I, or just about any photographer, could handhold at 1/80th of a second at 70mm. This is why people who are shooting with very telephoto lenses really need to have them on a tripod. The shutter speeds they need just to handhold them are kind of extreme. So, what shutter speed is going too fast? Well, let's examine some scenarios. If I'm shooting a person walking, well, 1/60th of a second is probably fine. If I'm shooting a photograph of somebody running, 1/250th of a second should be necessary. Now, if that person running is kicking a ball, that ball is going to be moving faster than the person. I need to be faster still, so at least 1/1000th of a second, or faster for sports. If I'm shooting birds in flight, then I'm going to need to shoot at least 1/1600th of a second or faster. When I've done birds in flight, I have tended to want to do about a 1/2000th of a second, though I have gone as slow as a 1/1600th. So some people like to teach ISO by saying that you match ISO to the brightness in an environment. And this is overall true, but what happens if I need to shoot birds in flight? So I'm going to go to a 2,000th of a second on my f4 lens. And notice it's blinking the f4, the picture got darker, I know I'm underexposed. So I know I'm underexposed, but I can't compensate with my aperture, so I need my ISO. I'm going to bring it up until it stops blinking at me, and that's right around there. So here we are, bright sunny day, but I'm shooting at ISO 400. Why? It's necessary for the shutter speed I need. Remember, ISO is a crutch for your shutter speed. So we bring it up not based on the ambient light conditions, but it is more useful to bring up ISO as the shutter speed dictates. Now, I'm not shooting a bird in flight here. I've got a tree, I've got a yard. I don't need a 2,000th of a second. So I really want to shoot at ISO 100. That brings down my shutter speed until the picture is of the proper brightness. And maybe I want a different aperture. So if I go to 1/250th of a second, I'm shooting at f6.3, and that's totally fine. So let's take this to the test and go and try to shoot something moving and see what shutter speeds we need to be successful. So we're here and we're going to explore different shutter speeds as we're taking pictures at a park of some birds on the water. And we're going to take a look over here, and we've got some birds that are moving. And right now, if I take my shutter speed, let's see what happens if I slow this down. So I'm going to slow this down. This is a 60th of a second. And if I grab these birds and I shoot a picture or two, and then I look in at them, I'm going to see, looking in, that right there's a little bit of motion blur, not a lot. If I open this up and shoot even slower, this one's going to be a 30th of a second. I should have a bird over here that I can shoot. Looking on that one, we can see motion blur of that bird moving through the water. So that's not a very good result. We take this, that's 30th of a second. If I start going faster, here we're going to go, this is a 500th of a second. For the speed of the bird just floating and swimming on the water, should be just fine. We're going to take a look at that and look in at it and see that I've got detail of that bird in the water. Now, what if the bird was in flight? I would definitely want it to be faster than that. In fact, for birds in flight, I'm going to go to about a 1/1250th of a second. That's where I like to be for any kind of motion like that. But for right now, I've got that bird there. We're just going to stay here and we're going to shoot a couple pictures and see what happens. Hey, here we go, here we go, here we go. Oh, look at that. Yeah. Those are, oh, we got some more here.
Here I have some shots, and everything here was shot at 1/2000th of a second. So I've got the birds landing, and you'll notice in these a really shallow depth of field, the bird that's in focus is, of course, very much in focus, but right behind him, the birds are not. So I had to shoot at a brighter aperture, which gave shallower depth of field, but that gave the crispness of motion that I wanted. And with this bird in the water, I've also got really nice crispness of the little waves that are right around the bird and the detail in the feathers. And then I've got another bird landing here. And when I zoom into this shot, you can see that 2,000th of a second gets water droplets flying in the air. It gets the wings of the bird really crisp. And I should go to another photograph here and see the same detail in the action all over again, right here.
So now we understand the exposure triangle. We have our shutter duration, which we call shutter speed, the period of time that we are exposing the image for. We have how much light we're using, dictated by the aperture of our lens, and we have our sensitivity to light, which is increasing the signal that's on our imaging sensor. So shutter speed, aperture, ISO. These are the controls that we have at our disposal, and the better you are at using them, the better you are at manipulating them, the better a photographer you will be. So if we wanted to just work with our ISO, then we could be in program mode. But at that point, we would have to change our metering mode and our exposure compensation as the camera gave us different results, and we wouldn't be directly able to control the shutter speed for action or for motion blur, and we would not be able to control depth of field directly. If we move into aperture priority, which I find to be a favorite of most photographers that I meet, we are controlling the aperture, we are controlling the ISO, and the camera controls shutter speed. So shutter speed will fluctuate based on the way that the camera meters the scene. So we still care about the metering mode, and we still care about exposure compensation in case it gets it wrong. Now, follow me with this logic. If I'm in aperture priority mode, I have selected an ISO, and I have selected an aperture because I'm in aperture priority mode, then all that exposure compensation can possibly do is alter shutter speed, right? So if I'm in aperture priority and the camera is giving me a 1/60th of a second, and I take my exposure compensation and increase it to +1 stops, then the shutter speed will drop to 1/30th because I have to make up that light out of the exposure triangle. I can't magically make up that light. The same is true in shutter priority mode. I've selected a shutter speed, I have selected an ISO. So if I take the camera and it's giving me f5.6 and I take exposure compensation, make it -1, I will then be shooting at f8 because the exposure compensation is going to directly affect the exposure triangle. And if all I've given it to work with is aperture, then it will change aperture. If all I've given it to work with is shutter speed, then it will change shutter speed. So there's nothing added. There's no additional control we've gained through metering or exposure compensation. So if I point the camera one direction in center weighted metering and it gives me one exposure and I'm in aperture priority mode and I move the camera and it meters differently, and it meters that there is more light than it thought there was before, then the shutter speed will increase. It thinks there's more light, so it uses a faster shutter speed. Even if these are two objects that are lit by the same light source, they are just reflecting light differently. For instance, if you shot a picture of me wearing a black shirt and then a picture of the wall near me. So metering can only affect the exposure triangle, and exposure compensation can only affect the exposure triangle. In other words, if I'm shooting in program, aperture priority, or shutter priority mode, I still have to pay attention to metering and exposure compensation. I have to because the camera is dictating overall brightness, and those are my controls over telling the camera what kind of overall brightness I want. When I move into manual exposure, amazingly, things get easier. Because remember, we haven't added any controls. We have aperture, shutter, and ISO, and that's all that we have. That's all that we have as photographers. Yes, there's flash. Yes, there are things like neutral density filters that are really something we talk about in video kind of workshops. But realistically, we have three things. So if I go to manual exposure, where I directly control aperture, shutter, and ISO, then I'm no longer needing to work with exposure compensation. Am I? In fact, there are many cameras which only have one dial instead of two, where in order to access the additional exposure triangle control, you press and hold the exposure compensation button and spin the wheel. This is intentional. You don't need to use exposure compensation when you are shooting in manual. So if I shoot in manual, now I can ignore metering, I can ignore exposure compensation, I can just control the triangle, which is all I was doing to begin with. And as a trade-off from having to constantly look at and adjust the way that the camera is giving us an exposure, I have to pay attention to the way that I am producing the exposure. Because I can produce an image in manual that is totally black or totally white, overexposed, underexposed, if I want to, and there's nothing stopping me. So how do we make these decisions, and what kind of freedom do we get by doing so? Well, let's just imagine a scenario. I walk into a room and I take a look at the exposure that I'm kind of getting in the room, and we'll talk about how I do that in a second. And let's say that a proper exposure is ISO 100, f8 at 1/60th of a second. So 1/60th of a second, f8 ISO 100. That's a proper exposure in the environment we're talking about. But I forgot to tell you, we're shooting sports. We're shooting sports. Well, that's going to be a problem, isn't it? Because while this will be, for brightness purposes, correct, it will be incorrect for purposes of aesthetics. In other words, 1/60th is not nearly fast enough for shooting action. Okay, so what can I do here? Well, I need to come back to the stop system. All right, remember, we measure our ISO, our shutter speed and our aperture in terms of stops, twice as much and half as much. If I take my shutter speed and I double it, right, then I've lost a stop of light. So if I go to 1/125th of a second, I'm one stop underexposed. But if I take my aperture and open it from f8 to f5.6, I'm now at exactly the same brightness. All that's changed are the aesthetics. I'm now a faster shutter speed with a shallower depth of field, which is appropriate for sports. 1/125th is probably not fast enough, so I can do this again. 1/250th of a second, open my aperture to f4. What if that's not fast enough? Well, then I can go to 1/500th of a second at f2.8 ISO 100. Now let us imagine that the lens we are shooting with is a 70-200 f2.8, meaning it cannot open any brighter than f2.8, but I need a 1/1000th of a second. This is where ISO comes into play. I go to 1/1000th of a second at f2.8 ISO 200. And then I can go higher still, 2000th of a second at ISO 400, so forth and so on. So this type of calculation is how we look at light in any situation. There is no time that you walk into an environment and we think of light differently. We have three things to work with. And here is the system that I think will make you a faster and better photographer. We have three things in the exposure triangle, and for brightness purposes, they are all equal, which is why the exposure triangle is called the exposure triangle, and it's always drawn as an equilateral triangle. Why? Because all corners are, for math, equal, but all are not equal when it comes to aesthetics. So here's the way to make yourself a faster photographer. The first thing we talked about early in the course, and that is I walk into an environment and I want to take a look at where's the light coming from and what kind of brightness is it on my subject. So that means understanding something about light, understanding something about my subject. But let's move farther still. Next, I need to know what kind of an image I want to produce. Is it a landscape image? Is it a portrait image? Is it a sports and action image? What basic category does it fall into? And if I know that, then one part of the exposure triangle is going to be most important. In our example here, that's going to be shutter speed. I need a certain shutter speed to be aesthetically correct, and that's a fast shutter speed. So we move that shutter speed to where we need it to be, because if I'm not aesthetically correct, there was no point in taking the photograph, was there? So I move my shutter speed to 1/1000th of a second. Then the other aspects of the triangle work to serve that first corner. Does that make sense? I pick one aspect or one corner of the triangle to be most important. I move it into position for where I want it, and the other two corners work to serve it. That means opening up the aperture, in our example, as much as we can, and taking the ISO and bringing it up, if necessary, in order to make the picture bright enough. The other two corners work to serve brightness. The first one works to serve aesthetics. Let's imagine shooting a portrait scenario with this exact same concept. Now, in a traditional portrait, I want a very blurred background, a shallow depth of field. So that means my aperture is going to be most important. I'm going to take my aperture and I'm going to open it up and make it brighter. Let's say f2. Now, there's a certain amount of light in the environment, and if I'm shooting at f2, then I probably am letting in a decent amount of light. So I'm going to take my ISO, and if I can help it, drop it all the way to 100. Why? That's probably my best image quality. So now I have two corners of the triangle fixed. Once that is done, shutter speed is my control over brightness. Please note, this is exactly the same as if you were shooting in aperture priority, where aperture and ISO get selected and exposure compensation and metering affect the shutter speed. So we move shutter speed until the picture is bright enough. Now, why is shooting in manual better than aperture priority? The first is going to be the 18% gray rule, that I'm going to get exactly the exposure I want independent of the reflective properties of the subject. White fur on an animal, a black shirt on a subject. Secondly, if I move the camera as we examined in metering, I will produce different exposures, but I want consistency in my results. If I'm in manual and I lock an exposure into place, I will produce exactly that result. And if I move my camera from place to place, and the background changes, but the light on the subject does not, I will continue to produce accurate results even though the background changes. So consistency and accuracy improve as we shoot more manually. In other words, in auto, we have no consistency and possible accuracy. And as we go into program and select metering and exposure compensation and aperture priority and start selecting aperture, as we move towards manual, we gain greater consistency and greater accuracy to what we want. Because accuracy is measured on what you want as the photographer. Now, how do I know if I'm correct? How do I know if I am producing an accurate shot? Let's look at a couple ideas behind that. Well, here's going to be the first. If I want to examine an image properly, I need to look at what's called the histogram. The histogram is your most powerful tool, and I would argue the only tool you need to produce a quality result. The only tool you need to produce a quality result. A histogram is essentially a two-dimensional bar graph, and it examines the brightness of the pixels throughout the image as they're dispersed through the image. So on the left side of the histogram, you're going to find underexposed or darker pixels. Remember, underexposed or shadows look the same to the camera as something that actually is black. On the right side of the histogram, you're going to have overexposed pixels or white pixels. Now, the walls are what matter, the actual limits. If I am all the way over on the left side of the wall, that's a pure black pixel. If it touches the wall, it's done what we call clipping. Clipping is where there is no more detail. It is just a pure black pixel, and if I took it into an editing program and lightened it, I would never draw detail out of it. I could make it gray, but I could never pull detail out of it. Something right next to the wall, I possibly could. On the opposite side, on the right side of the histogram, are pure white pixels. And if I darken them, they will turn gray, but I'll never pull detail out of them. If you see really big white blotches in the sky, that's what you're seeing, is these pixels that have turned into pure white. Now, let's say I have something in the shadow that has clipped. It's black. That point of darkness and everything darker still will all register exactly the same to the camera. In other words, they'll all show as the exact same pure black clipped pixel. The same is true of the pure white pixels. In other words, something that's bright in the sky that clips, everything brighter still is going to be the same shade of white, and that's how you get these blocky kind of patterns. So I'm comfortable producing an image in camera that may not be exactly the brightness I want, if I have created detail spread throughout the histogram and not clipped on either end. A proper exposure for me and for any class I teach is one where I have produced in camera something that does not clip on either end. And if I have to choose which way it's shifted, I will always choose a little bit underexposed. Imaging sensors produce more data on their underexposed side rather than their overexposed side. In other words, they clip more easily on the bright side of the exposure and create more detail in the shadows. That's not true of the way that film was, by the way. Film actually was equal on both sides of proper exposure before the pixels clipped. Or not pixels, but the actual film grains. Sensors produce more data on the on the dark side of the histogram. So I purposely underexpose a little bit if that means getting detail spread throughout the sky in my frame, and I can bring those shadows up later. This is a technique that's actually called either protecting highlights or exposing to the left. Exposing to the left specifically refers to the histogram and how underexposed pixels are the left side of the histogram. So I'm shooting in manual and I'm reviewing my images with the histogram turned on. Always review images with the histogram turned on. There is no SLR in the world that cannot review images with the histogram turned on. So always review them that way. Look for clipping. Secondly, as you shoot and choose exposure information, you're going to get faster, much faster, at being able to look at an environment and guess what kind of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO that you need. However, Let's say that you want a shortcut as you're getting good at this. Here's a fast one. You go to an environment and you want to shoot manually, but you don't know where to begin. Well, here's an idea. Take your camera, put it in program mode, and just snap a picture. When you review it, you're going to know two essential things: the exposure triangle of that shot, and you'll know the histogram. So you can look at it and say, okay, this was a 1/60th of a second f8 at ISO 100, and let's take a look at it. And the histogram looks fine. So now I can take my camera, put it into manual, plug in those numbers, and produce the same image. But now I'll produce it every single time. And if I want to alter it, as we did earlier, taking it from 1/60th at f8 to a 1/500th at f2.8, I can do that very quickly in the camera, and it's not going to fight me on it. I'm going to get that exposure. And no matter where I point my camera, I will continue to get that exposure. So this is a good shortcut. Remember, the stop system is programmed in 1/3 stop increments. So I always know, without even looking at my camera, if I take that dial and I move it 1, 2, 3 notches, I've moved it by 1 stop. I can go to the other dial on my camera and move it 1, 2, 3 notches, and I've 1 stop the other way. Meaning I can do this type of work, maintain the same exposure, without ever needing to double check, though I do anyway. So what we're going to examine now in our mechanics portion is actually doing that system. How do we do this? How do we start putting together manual exposure? How do we work these moving pieces, and what's our thought process as we do it? Let's take this through very completely and slowly. I have several of my lenses set up here, just as something to have in the frame to be able to work with, and I'm going to use these as demonstration for our focusing techniques and several other things as well. And right now we want to move from aperture priority into fully manual, as you see me do there. And so I'm still set up here from another shoot, and so it immediately is way too dark. This is ISO 200 at f16 at 1/640th of a second. Well, that's obviously not going to work. So what do I want to do? What I can do here is start working with the scene, but I need to make some creative decisions first. What type of a shot is this? Is it a landscape shot? Is it a portrait shot? Am I hand holding it? Is it on a tripod? Is it an action shot? Well, this particular one is going to be on a tripod, and it's a still life or a portrait shot or some kind of macro shot or some kind of product photography shot. In other words, an unmoving subject. And since I'm on a tripod with an unmoving subject, we immediately take our ISO and we drop that down to 100. Now I actually just made the frame even darker still, but that's okay because I know that I want to be ISO 100. We only bring up the ISO when we need a faster shutter speed. And in this instance, neither the subject is moving nor am I hand holding the shot, so I do not need a faster shutter speed. So we make our ISO decision first in that instance. Next, I'm going to decide the aperture that I want. Do I want this to have a very shallow depth of field, or do I want it to have a larger depth of field? Well, let's say that I want all three of these lenses to be effectively in focus. That means that I want to use this more stopped down aperture of f16. Well, that means that my shutter speed is going to have to be longer. So let's take a look at my shutter speed. If I have this and I move my dial, it's going to start getting brighter. Now, I'm doing this through a dial on the back of the camera. Most cameras will have two dials, one for aperture and one for shutter. If you only have one dial, then spinning it by itself will change usually shutter speed. Pressing and holding another button on the camera while spinning the dial will change the aperture value. So you'll have to look at your camera to see which one of those applies to you. And I'm just going to open this guy up until I get the brightness that I want, which I would say is about there. Notice this is a full second exposure. So if I grab focus and I shoot, it's exposing the shot for 1 full second. But when I take a look at it, oops, when I take a look at it, I have a shot where the aperture is giving me detail on the back lens, the middle lens, and the side lens, which is what I said I wanted. What if instead I wanted a shallow depth of field shot? Well, I'm going to take my aperture and I'm going to open it. Remember, you choose one thing, one part of the triangle to be your creative decision. Everything else works to serve it. So one corner is a creative decision, the other two are practical decisions. In this particular shot, the aperture is the creative decision. So shutter speed and ISO move in order to give me the exposure I want. If I lock ISO based on what my necessity is, given movement of the subject, movement of the camera, then what I've done is make my shutter speed responsible for brightness. So right now it's way overexposed, as you can see, but if I take my shutter speed and I start closing it down, I can arrive at an exposure that I'm happy with. Shoot that photograph and I'm happy with the exposure, but if I look in at it, I've got the edge of the lens in focus and it's so shallow that part of that same lens is not in focus, and of course that front lens is out. Now I'm not happy with the fact that the words are out of focus, so that would be a focusing issue. What I would do in that instance, and we're going to talk about focusing technique later on in class, is make a smaller crosshair, place it over those letters, and fire and shoot there. So now let's take a look at that image. We're reviewing this one. We zoom in on it, and here's how shallow our depth of field is. Notice the edge of the lens on both sides is out of focus, and of course so are the front and the back lenses. So I've moved my aperture in order to give me the depth of field that I want. In this instance, it was f1.8, because that is the shallowest depth of field this particular lens can do. This is a 55mm f1.8 lens, meaning that I can achieve f1.8 if I want to. Everything else moved to serve it. ISO 100 at 1/80th of a second. Now I could, if I wanted to, change this exposure, make it darker or make it brighter. And how do I know if I'm making appropriate decisions? Well, I'm going to change my display information here until I view a histogram. There it is right there. Now, let's examine talking about the histogram. I have a white lens and two black lenses here. So I should expect spikes on the black and the white side of the frame. Remember the histogram, as you're taking a look at it there, the left side is underexposed areas or areas that are black. Remember the camera cannot differentiate between the two. The right area is going to be white objects or light sources or things that are overexposed. The camera cannot differentiate between those. So I should expect, with black and white lenses in the frame, I should expect spikes on the left and right side of the histogram. Take a look at what happens here. I'm going to take my shutter speed and I'm going to make it darker. Watch as the histogram bunches up on the left side of the frame. Now, please notice the spike on the wall. If something touches the walls, it is clipping. Those are pure black pixels where I've lost information or detail. If I shoot that photograph, and then we're going to look in on it, there are areas of these lenses that are pure blotches of black with no information. Well, that's obviously not a good exposure. If I take it the other direction, watch as the histogram starts bunching up on the right side of the frame. So now it's started to clip, and now it's clipping more and more and more. And now that lens is definitely overexposed. Take a look at the black lenses. They're gray rather than black, which is of course not accurate. If I zoom in on this, here's the image. If I zoom in on it and I go over here, I have areas of this lens that are pure white blotches. They've lost information. That's obviously not correct either. So what I want is a histogram that does not touch either wall. And I have one here. So this is a correct exposure. If I go a little bit darker, I'm still not touching either wall. That's a correct exposure. If I move over here, I'm good until the moment right about there, that some part of it touches the wall, and now even more so. So I would say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 different exposures that are accurate, that would give me information pixel for pixel, corner to corner within the frame. I need to choose the one that I like best, and maybe I want it to be a little bit darker, maybe I want it to be a little bit brighter, and that's entirely my decision. Remember, if you have to choose between part of the frame definitely being a little bit underexposed and part of the frame being a little bit overexposed, choose underexposed. The camera records more information in the dark side of the sensor, or the underexposed parts of the image, than on the bright side. It clips more easily on the bright side of the image. So we don't want that. At this point, I can decide that that's a good exposure, and every picture I shoot is going to be exactly the same. Let's take a look at an easy way to arrive here. If I take my camera and I move over to program mode, notice it didn't really change. We figured out a pretty good exposure. And I shoot a picture and I review it. This viewing tells me, okay, that's what the shot looks like. And it's not super useful. If I press my display or my information button, then I can start bringing up more information about it. So this tells me a little bit about the date and the time. But going here gives me my histogram. It tells me areas that are about to clip. That's the blinking that you see. And it tells me my histogram for exposure and for each color channel. Now I'm not looking at the color channel ones, but I do want to see that, yep, this histogram, while it is blinking, is not clipping at either end, so I'm happy with that. And look at the exposure, ISO 100 f2 at 1/60th of a second. 1/60th f2 ISO 100. So if I move over here to manual, I'm in ISO 100. I'm going to take my aperture to f2, and then my shutter speed, make sure it's 1/60th. It is exactly the same image. Now, if I thought that the last image was fine, but I wanted it to be a little bit brighter, I can start here, and then I'd be able to change my exposure. That's a 50th, just a little bit brighter. But it gives me a fast way to start. If I can start here and say, oh, you know what, this is a good starting place, but I know I want it to be a more stopped down aperture, well, then I could quickly do that. And remember, everything is in third stop increments. So let's say I wanted to go to f5.6. Let's take my aperture. 1, 2, 3 is 2.8. 4, 5, 6 is f4. 7, 8, 9 is f5.6. So if I take my shutter speed and do 9 clicks, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 clicks brighter, it's exactly the same exposure. Because remember, aperture and shutter speed and ISO are all measured in third stop increments. So I can easily adjust one to the other in order to get a different shot. And I could walk that exposure all the way up and down the aperture and shutter speed scale, so long as I still have values I can go to. Now let's take this idea and go shooting. So how do we put this into action? How do we actually make creative decisions as we're shooting? Well, to put that into practice, we're shooting a sunset scene here at the park, and we're going to be making creative decisions on the fly. It's a landscape photograph, so because it's a landscape photograph on a tripod, ISO immediately goes to 100. There's no reason why I'd shoot at anything else. So if I take a look at this, right now we're 1/60th of a second at f4, and that's obviously very bright. As I start closing down my shutter speed, I am darkening the frame. I can also close down the aperture. And this is a lens that goes from f4 all the way to f22. So I can see that that's definitely going to be too dark. And I can decide something that I want to be creatively correct. In other words, maybe this very dark, moody shot here is what I'm going for. Maybe if I opened it up a little bit, maybe that kind of better exposure with a little bit of silhouette is what I want. And maybe opening it up even a little bit brighter is what I'm going for. I don't know. But what would I really ideally like? Well, it's a landscape scene, so I'll probably take my aperture and go somewhere between f8 and f11. And that's f11 right there. And that's not a bad exposure. We might come back to it. Let's take our shutter speed. And at this point, notice that we're choosing aperture as our creative value. We're going to ISO and putting it at 100 because we're on a tripod. So all that remains is to make the shutter speed be the proper brightness. So I get to decide what proper brightness is. Maybe that right there is. It's got a decent amount of silhouette, but some nice color saturation. Maybe going a little bit brighter like that would be what I want. I think we're going to choose right about there. And the reason I'm choosing this is if I look at my histogram, I'm not clipping at either end. Because I'm not clipping, I have values that I can work with. So we're going to go ahead and shoot that photograph. And I think that looks pretty good. So let's see what happens if I then do some repositioning. Maybe I can shoot it like that. Take a look at the histogram. It still looks good. I'm able to focus and shoot. And I'll be able to take these and play with them more after the fact. So proper exposure is when I don't clip on the histogram at either end. I'm going to default to being a little bit darker rather than a little bit brighter because I'm going to gather more information that way. And I'm going to be able to, in this case, keep the same aperture for the same depth of field, but be able to choose the brightness based on the shutter speed. If I was shooting sports in action, then shutter speed would be selected first. ISO and aperture would be the things that I would adjust in order to get the brightness of the frame that I wanted. So now I might just shoot a couple more like this and see what happens. We have examined the exposure system of the camera. We've understood something about how color is different than exposure. But now let's tackle the other part of the camera system, and that's going to be its focusing operation. We're going to have 3 sets of lectures on the focusing operation. In this section, we're going to be tackling the essentials of how the focusing operation actually works in the camera and how manual focus and autofocus work in similar but different ways. So let's start to examine that. The most common misconception about the focusing system in cameras is that your camera focuses on a subject. This is not true. Your camera focuses to a distance because your lens drives focus to hit a proper focus for some particular distance away. Now, every other system in your camera is there to try to identify more quickly and more accurately what distance should be in focus. But let's just take a step back and examine this idea that your lens focuses to one distance in any one shot. What this means is if I acquire focus on something and this something is at a certain distance away, and then I take the camera, put it into manual focus, and move the lens until it is focused to that same distance, I will wind up with the exact same shot. And this, of course, is true. Every other system we're going to examine, and in a little bit we're going to be examining subject identification, subject tracking. All of these things are there to identify the proper distance, to do it more quickly and to do it more accurately. But for any of those shots, if we manually focus to the same distance, we would wind up with the same photograph. Initially, in this set of lectures, what I want to examine is basics of finding a subject, focusing and firing, and how that is going to be the same as if we had manually focused. I find myself focusing in manual for a few night photography shots, and for some video. This shot that you're watching right now is manually focused. And I use autofocus for the majority of my stills shooting. But it's good to understand how this system is operating. So what we're going to do right now is take a camera and we're going to focus on some subjects, and we are going to look at how manual focus and autofocus have similar attributes. Let's examine our focusing system. Remember, your focusing system always focuses to a distance. Anything that would be also in that distance will then be equivalently in focus. So if I focus to a foot away, anything a foot away is going to be equivalently in focus. So that means that I don't really focus on a subject, and we're going to take a look at that. In the next two lectures, we're going to look at how we decide where in the frame to focus, and if it locks there or if it continuously adjusts. That's where we're going. But right now I just want to explore the basics of working with the focusing system. And let's initially look at the way that it operates out of the box, which is in basic autofocus that uses the entire frame. And right now, as you're seeing, I'm acquiring focus on the hood of this lens here. So that is at some particular pardon me, distance. If I take my camera and I move it into manual focus mode and I adjust focus and I pull that hood into focus, it is focused to the exact same distance and therefore is the exact same shot, as we can see here. So focusing manually, as I'm doing here, and I can actually navigate through the frame. Let's say I wanted to acquire focus on this lens here. If I pull that into focus like that, which looks good, and I shoot a picture, and then, let's review it there, it looks good. I go to a single autofocus point, or say autofocus S, where it acquires focus. And I'm going to make sure I focus on that. Oops. I'm going to make sure I focus on this exact same point. Focus there. Shoot. The lens acquired focus to the same distance in both photographs. Therefore, if I review this one and look in at it, it looks the same. We were actually switching between these two photographs here. Now they're slightly different exposures, just barely, because I'm not in a manual mode, and that's a good thing because you can tell that they are two different images, but they're focused the same because the lens acquired focus to the same distance. Therefore, they are identical to each other. We got there through different mechanisms. Now let's explore the concept that in fact we focus to a distance. We do not focus on a subject. I'm going to take these three lenses and I'm going to place them in a line equidistant. If I use this crosshair, and you see this little box here, we can see it there in the frame. If I put that over this same word, Battis in this case, and I acquire focus there, you would say, oh, he's focused on this subject. But in fact, I'm focused to that distance. So if I shoot there, review the image, zoom in on it, that word, of course, is in focus, but if I move over here, this lens is also perfectly in focus. So is this lens here. Because they're the same distance to the subject, they're subjects that are the same distance to the camera, therefore they are equivalently in focus. Now, what if I have these three lenses at slightly different distances, but I want them all in focus? If I acquire focus there, please take a look at my exposure. I'm shooting at f16 right now. If I shoot that photograph, then the focusing system focused on the word Battis. Anything else at different distances that is in focus is only in focus because of depth of field. In other words, the focusing system only focuses to one distance. Now, if I look at this lens here, it still is pretty much in focus. If I look at this front lens, it's also quite in focus. They are at different distances. The reason that they are in focus is because of depth of field. So remember, depth of field covers anything in focus that's not that specific distance. Now, let's take this basic idea and just do a little bit of shooting. What we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at the way that your focusing system is operating in a very basic sense. We've got lectures coming up about the different ways of manipulating the focusing distance to be accurate with both unmoving and moving subjects. But right now, we just want to take a look at how this is essentially operating. So I have a subject outside. It's this plant kind of growing in the backyard. And if I use an autofocus technique here, I can focus, and we see that it's grabbing focus on the camera. And if I move where I focus to somewhere else, of course what that means is I'm focusing to a different distance. Now this lens happens to show me where I'm focusing, what distance away. And I know with this part of the little bush or shrubbery outside that I'm focusing at 2.3 meters away. If I move this crosshair to a different part of the plant and focus, let's say, there, then I know this is 1.8 meters away. So 2.3 and 1.8. All right, if I take my focusing system now and I change it to manual focus, and I take this and I focus until it says 2.3 meters away, then you're going to notice that this is the same shot that I had at the very beginning, focused to 2.3 meters away. Whether I got there manually or through the camera's automated functions does not make a difference to the end result. If I take the lens and I focus it to 1.8 meters away, right there, this is that second picture. Again, I achieved it this time through a manual focus setting, but it's the same photograph as if I'd used the camera to automatically focus. So whichever way I get there produces the same result. Okay? Camera focuses to a distance, not to a subject. When can we actually take this into account? Well, if I'm shooting some kind of wildlife, I can focus to the distance of the nest and wait for the bird to come in and land. And then if I switch the lens over to manual focus, it won't change on me. Some people use a system called back button autofocus, where they have one button that focuses that is not the shutter release button. So they can focus first, and if a subject comes into parallel with an object already in focus, then that subject will be in focus. Here's another way that this can be useful. Portrait photographers like to use a system where they focus on the eye of the subject. Well, some cameras have an eyeball autofocus system that's built into the camera, so they can use a button, focus to the eye, have the shutter button not be able to focus, and then when they go to shoot the picture, the eye remains in focus, even if they shoot the picture a second or 5 seconds later. So there's lots of ways that we can put this knowledge into practice. But right now, we can set up a shot and we can achieve focus in one of several ways, and both are going to provide us with the same basic end result. Now we understand how the focusing system is working in general, how the lens focuses to a distance. But what we want to understand better is how to make sure that the lens is focusing to the appropriate distance, or the creatively correct distance. And for the moment, we're going to be examining non-moving subjects. So this set of lectures is all about things like macro photography, or portraiture, or landscapes, or product photography, something with unmoving subjects. In these instances, we want to be able to lock focus. Now, there's going to be a couple ways that we can do this, but let's start with the two main menu options you have over focusing. That's going to be your focus area and your focus mode. Let's start with focus mode. Focus mode answers the question, does the camera focus? And if it does it adjust focus as you are shooting? For non-moving subjects, we do not want it to adjust focus as we are shooting. But inside of autofocus mode, you're going to find several options. You're going to find AFS, AFA, AFC, and most cameras will list manual focus inside of this menu, though some do not and rely you to turn manual focus and autofocus on and off with a switch on the lens. AFS, or autofocus single shot, is your best tool for non-moving subjects. It stands for single shot, but I want you to think of it as autofocus static, as in a static or unmoving subject. I think that's the easiest to remember. With AFS turned on, you can lock focus at a distance and it won't readjust, which will allow you to focus and compose the shot separately. AFA is something I'm going to advise you to not use. But here's how it works. AFA, or autofocus auto, tries to determine for you if your subject is moving, And then if it thinks your subject is moving, it can refocus the image without further permission from you. There are a couple issues I have with this. By reframing the shot, the camera might think your subject is moving and can change. Additionally, I trust you to know if your subject is likely to move or not. And the camera is not going to be nearly as intelligent as understanding your subject as you are. So I don't find AFA to be useful. I find that it hinders my photography more than it assists. Autofocus C, autofocus continuous, is going to be for moving subjects, and we're going to deal with that in the next set of lectures. So for right now, for unmoving subjects, we could use manual focus, as we talked about in the last series, but right now I want to deal with AFS, autofocus single shot, which I want you to think of as autofocus static. With this mode, we can lock focus, like I said. Now, the autofocus area, the other set of menu options for focusing that I want you to start examining, is going to be answering the question of where the camera will try to find a subject. It wants to figure out what you're looking at so it can figure out that distance and focus appropriately for you. And you're going to have several options inside of here, which I'm going to describe. The first one is going to be some kind of wide or evaluative focusing system, which is going to use all parts of the frame that it has focusing crosshairs in order to acquire focus. And with that large of an area, it has to have some kind of programming or primer to determine some kind of prioritization system. And in fact, there are two priorities when you give the camera more carte blanche or more autonomy when determining focus. The first is that things in the center of the frame will be prioritized. The second is that things closer to the camera will be prioritized. When we do a demonstration of this in just a little bit, you're going to see how these two priorities can combat and fight each other. And this is why you can get inconsistencies or inaccuracies with a wide or evaluative focusing system. But it is going to be one that works immediately. It works with the least amount of input on your behalf, which is why the camera comes out of the box set this way. Every other form of AFS area that we can use truncates the frame a little bit more and relies on more decision making on your part. The next one's going to be a zone autofocus area. This is where instead of the entirety of the frame, we've narrowed it to some definable zone that you can navigate through. And with an autofocus zone, the camera will use the same priorities, centered objects, things closer, but only identified within this subsection of the frame. This can be that little bit more accurate, but if your subject leaves the zone, your camera can't find it. The most accurate, which means the most input on your part, is going to be a crosshair selection. Now, a crosshair is a place in the frame where the camera can acquire focus, and you have the option of having an autofocus area where you select one crosshair, and that is the only one the camera uses to focus. Whatever's in that crosshair is going to be the place where the camera derives distance and acquires focus. You can navigate this through the frame. Simply put that crosshair over your subject and you're in business. Now, we combine the autofocus area with the autofocus mode in order to get something that's appropriate for the type of shot we're doing. So what we're going to do next is we're going to set up some objects and we're going to start shooting some pictures, moving the crosshair, moving the zone, or using the entire evaluative frame and see how they differ from one another. Let's examine how to start working with our focusing system. So we've got our camera set up and we're ready to start doing autofocus single shot so we can lock focus and reposition the camera as we want to. All right, so let me move that into position, and I've got my layout of my lenses here so that we have something to be able to work with. And for a static or unmoving subject, I want to be an AFS. Remember, autofocus auto tries to figure out if your subject is moving and can change things on you, so I'm not a big fan of working with that. Autofocus continuous is for the next set of lectures. So I'm going to go to autofocus single shot, which I'm selecting right here. Now I got to that through a quick button in my camera. But if I go into my menu, I'm going to be able to search around and find my focusing mode, which is where I ask the question of, does the camera acquire focus and does it adjust focus? And that's where AFS is going to be, as you see me selecting right now. Okay. We've got autofocus single shot selected. That's going to be able to acquire focus for us, as we did right there. Now, where does it look for this subject? Well, we've got a couple options. I'm going to pull up my focusing area. I'm doing it through a quick button here. But if I press my menu button, I'm also going to be able to scroll around and find focusing area. I want you to notice that I'm not memorizing my menu, because the vast majority of it I don't touch very often, and I know the things that I want to be able to look for and to find. So instead of memorizing it, I find it a lot better just to search for the thing that I'm looking for and not try to memorize. This has something in the neighborhood of 62 pages of menus. So focus area, wide, right there. Now I've got several options. This is my focus area. I've got wide, I've got zone. This particular camera has center, though you may not find that on yours, which is where it's just the middle of the frame and I can't adjust that. Something we're going to be taking a look at, which is the ability to navigate a focusing crosshair. This camera calls it flexible spot, but this is a crosshair selection. Then this camera has some options that other cameras may not have, so I'm not going to get into those because this is not a course about this particular camera, but on things you'll find on all cameras. So let's take a look at these one at a time. I'm going to start with this wide area. This is where it's going to find a subject, as you see it doing here, based on two ideas. The first being things in the middle of the frame are prioritized. The second being that things closer to the camera are prioritized. Now it's finding the middle lens here very quickly, and it's not looking at the edges. And that's because it's very centered. What happens if I move this subject there? Now it finds that one because it's closer. It may not be as centered, but being closer is also priority. What if I want to make sure that I focus on the appropriate lens? Well, I can move that lens to the center, focus on it, and while holding my focusing button, then reposition the camera. And this is called focus lock and focus hold. What if I want to be the back lens? Find it, put it in the middle, focus, and then reposition. The fact that the green dots are still there is only telling me that that is the place where it acquired focus within the frame. So I can manipulate the camera to try to acquire focus and reposition. Let's take a look at another way that we can work with this. If I look at my autofocus zone, it's going to be an area that I define like this. And then we'll use the exact same ideas to find a subject. So if I move the zone all the way over to the bottom left, then the thing that's centered within that zone is this front lens, and it's going to find it every time. If I move it over to the middle, then it's still finding that one. Here it finds that guy. And so I've got to be careful with where I position it. If I go to the center, it's just the very middle of the frame, and I cannot adjust that. But it is a quick way of being able to center subject, acquire focus, and reposition. And remember, when I'm doing that, I'm holding that focus button down. The last one is going to be if I navigate my focusing crosshair. Here, I've got that same crosshair, but I can manipulate it. I can move it to wherever I want it to go. So if I move it over this lens, it'll acquire focus there. And if I review that image, I know that if I look in on it, that lens is in focus. If I move over to this lens, it's less in focus. And if I move it over to the front lens, it's even less still. Now, oops, didn't mean to do that. I can navigate that over here. And any of these will let me focus lock and focus hold. Anytime I'm working with a non-moving subject, I can use this to be very specific in how I acquire focus. So now let's take these ideas and go out shooting. Okay, so we are at a very nice park and we're going to be testing out different ways of getting to and using autofocus S or AFS, autofocus single. This is where I can lock focus and then reposition the camera afterwards. So I'm shooting with my camera here and we're shooting at this nice park. And I want to make sure that I'm getting to the AFS option. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at my focusing mode. Now there's a couple ways I can do this. The first is I know that I've got a direct button that will bring me up to it. So I have my AFS, AFA, AFC. In this camera I've got something that's called dynamic manual focus, which allows me to autofocus and then adjust, and full, of course, manual focus mode. So we're using AFS here. Now, how else could I get to this? Well, there will also be a way of getting to it inside of the menu. And if I look inside of my menu, I can look around until I find some focusing options. And I'll find focusing mode here. And of course, that's going to bring me to the exact same options list. And there's usually inside of a camera a quick menu, or something that allows me to press a button and quickly get to options inside of the menu. Now I have taken AFS out of the quick menu of this camera, but it comes inside of most of your cameras initially. You can just also change it and move it. So what am I going to be able to do here? Well, first, if I want to make sure that this tree here is in focus, if I place it there, the camera's not finding it initially. So what I can do is go over here, press and hold focus, reposition, and then I'd be able to fire the picture. Let's actually get our exposure to look good here. Let's take our ISO and let's bring it to 100. And then let's go ahead and let's take our aperture and I think lower that down a little bit, bring our histogram into alignment. Cool. So if I want to get this shot to look good, I can grab the focus here, bring it over, and snap a picture. And there we go. I've got, if I bring it up, there's the image that I just shot. Now that looks totally fine. So that's one way of being able to use it. Again, if I went straight to focusing, it found something I didn't want. But if I reposition the camera, oops, grabbed it, repositioned over here, see those green boxes mean that it still is in focus because I'm holding that down. It allows me to shoot. Now how else could I operate inside of this mode? Well, let's go to the AF area, which allows me to find the subject. Again, this is going to be either a quick button or inside of your function menu, or of course inside of your full menu option, I can find my focus area. So we're going to deal with focus area in a different set of lectures. But initially, if I have my positioning just the way that I want it here, and I go into my focus area and go to the place where I can actually choose a point of focus, it'll allow me to move this focusing crosshair wherever I want it to go. And that's that little box that you see there. I can move it over this tree, acquire focus there, and wind up with the same picture. So this is how I can use AFS in conjunction with a focusing mode, focusing area rather, in order to get what I want. Again, if I'm in the kind of larger or wide or evaluative focusing mode, I'm more likely to have to acquire focus and then reposition the camera before firing. So that is how you use AFS as you're operating and able to lock focus and reposition the camera. We understand something about the way we can lock focus on a static or an unmoving subject. And that's going to be great for many things we shoot photographs of. But what about when we are shooting pictures of a moving subject? Sports, wildlife, any kind of event photography where things are happening around us. We need to be able to adjust focus to this. So let's examine how we deal with moving subjects, both in autofocus area and autofocus mode. Obviously, in order to be able to deal with a moving and continuously moving subject, our autofocus mode needs to be set up for a continuous adjustment. So AFC, or autofocus continuous, is specifically what we're going to be using. In this mode, so long as you are pushing down your focusing button halfway or all the way, in the case of a separated focusing button, it would just be pushing it down. In the case of the shutter mechanism, halfway is constantly focusing, all the way is focusing and shooting still images. So long as we're pushing this button down, it is always trying to acquire focus. So I cannot focus lock, focus hold, and reposition anymore. That's not going to work because it will just focus on something new. Instead, I need to either work with keeping my subject in a portion of the frame where I can guarantee as much success as possible, or use some form of subject tracking if my camera has that available. Let's talk about both of those kinds of options. If I am working with a camera that does not have subject tracking, then I will really have two major ways that I can try to acquire focus. I could use a wide or an evaluative autofocus area, or I can use an individually selected crosshair. If I'm working with a wide area, the camera will try to determine what the subject is using the two primers we've already discussed. That is, things in the center of the frame are prioritized and things that are closer are prioritized. Later on in this series, we're going to go and shoot some pictures of birds, and we're going to find that they could move anywhere within the frame, and they're going to be farther away. So this is going to sometimes work and sometimes not. If, on the other hand, I can move my camera in conjunction with this moving subject and put a focusing crosshair over the subject, I can continually focus and shoot, and so long as I keep the subject in that crosshair, then I will continually adjust and focus on that subject. This is more difficult to do, but will produce better results, or at least produce better results more often. Because in this instance, you're telling the camera exactly what to focus on. Now, the only two things stopping you from every shot in focus are the speed of the camera's autofocus system and your ability to keep the subject within that crosshair. It's much easier said than done. If, on the other hand, my camera does have subject tracking, then I want to use a wide or an evaluative focusing area, because that will allow the camera to track the subject throughout the entire frame. Different camera companies will describe this feature in different ways. There is specifically subject tracking in the world of Panasonic or in the world of Olympus. Nikon calls it 3D Matrix, and that's their subject tracking mode, which works very well. You have kind of a long and cumbersome name from Sony, which is going to be Lock-on Autofocus Expand Flexible Spot, or Lock-on Autofocus Wide Area. And in Canon, they actually provide with some of their cameras a full submenu just dedicated to turning on the subject tracking, where you can tell the camera what kind of erraticism or speed or acceleration and deacceleration to expect, which is a very intelligent system. When we put these into action, the camera will be utilizing the entirety of the frame and start attempting to focus and follow the subject. It still is using just the crosshairs that it has at its disposal, but the system within the camera is trying to figure out the shape of the subject and follow it as it moves. So what we're going to do now is grab a camera and we're going to take a look at each one of these mechanisms as we turn them on and how we work with them in a basic principle. Let's put these ideas into practice. We're working with our autofocus continuous concept, so we want to be in a continuously focusing mode, and we want to utilize the different areas that will allow us greatest success with moving subjects. Now, in order to go to a continuous focusing mode, you're going to have one of several of these options or multiples of these options. You have a direct button, as I have when I press this button right here, and that allows me to select from autofocus single shot, auto, continuous, dynamic manual focus on my camera, and manual focus. We're talking about continuous here. You will likely have it in a quick menu. Now, as I've said before, I've changed my quick menu and no longer have it inside of here. And you can usually adjust these to what you want. And we can also press our full menu And if we scroll around through it, we're going to be able to look and find our continuous focusing mode or focus mode, and it brings us to the exact same option. Any of those is going to be a perfectly legitimate way of getting to your continuous focusing mode. For moving subjects, that is going to be the best tool. Next, we need to think about the area we want to use. Initially, let's imagine we're using a camera that does not have a form of subject tracking. So, if I look at my focusing area, and I've got a quick button here that can bring me to it, but if I press my menu button, I will also have a focusing area option right here. And that's going to bring the same set of controls. Let's deal with the standard ones that every camera will have. First, let's begin with wide. If I'm in a wide focusing area, then it's going to assume that something in the middle of the frame is probably more important than things on the outside, which is why this camera is looking at initially that lens, and then it's also picking up this other one, and it can't seem to decide between them. Why is that? The reason is the thing in the middle is not the thing that's closest, and so it bounces back and forth between them, but it is defaulting more often than not on the center lens, though not always. If this lens that's closer moves farther to the side, the camera finds that center lens far more easily. It gets more confused as there is something that is closer. Let's take a look at what happens if I work with an autofocus zone. Remember, a zone uses the same ideas as a wide or an evaluative autofocus area, but only within a truncated part of the frame. If I take that zone and I move it to this corner here, then I'm finding this lens pretty well. But then it starts looking at the wall and the white lens that's behind it and on the side. That is because that zone looks at that lens a little bit more than the middle lens, even though the middle lens is in the corner of this particular zone. If I was to move this zone towards the center again, it finds that middle lens much more quickly. But let's take a look at what happens if we have an individual focusing crosshair. I'm going to move it to the middle so you can see it. That middle crosshair, I can navigate through the frame. If I put it on this lens here, I'm going to find it every time. Now, if I'm focusing on that lens and the lens moves out of the crosshair, it immediately grabs the wall. If I'm still focusing and the subject comes back into that crosshair, it grabs that subject because it's looking at that area. Remember, a lens focuses to a distance. So if I'm using this crosshair for it to evaluate distance, whatever it sees in that crosshair, it will focus to that distance. If I'm focusing and the subject stays there but gets closer and gets farther away, it continuously focuses on that subject throughout that movement because it has remained within the crosshair, and so it's reevaluating the distance. Move that crosshair onto another subject, it'll find that one and do the same job. Move it back to the first and it will do that job again. Now let's take a look at what we might do if we were working with a subject tracking system. I just moved my focusing area back to wide, and I did that because subject tracking always wants to be able to use the entirety of the frame. So let's turn on subject tracking in this camera. In this camera, it's something that's called Center Lock-On AF. We're going to turn that on, and it's going to give me this little box here, and I'm going to use that to identify that middle lens. Now, other cameras might work differently. In Nikon, you go to 3D focusing in continuous focusing mode, and it starts tracking the subject it identifies. They label autofocus tracking in the Olympus system, and of course there's a full menu for Canon shooters in their cameras that do subject tracking. In this one, we can identify that lens, and we can actually see it, find it, and follow it through the frame. As it does that, it's going to only look at that particular subject when it acquires focus. So that's going to work very effectively for us. Remember, if you don't have subject tracking, you're going to use either the wide area and keep the subject in the middle of the frame, or use the individual crosshair and keep the subject in that crosshair. Now let's take these ideas and go shooting. we're out here, we're back at the park, and we're shooting some pictures of birds on the water, and we want to understand autofocus continuous in a situation with moving subjects. So let's take a look. I've got some birds in the water over here, and as we saw before, I can move and be in autofocus continuous. And let's start with choosing a selecting point. If I take this and I move it and I put it over this subject, as long as the subject is there, then let's go ahead and shoot that. I wonder if I got that. So as long as I put this point over my subject, then they'll be in focus. But if the subject leaves that part of the frame, then it moves to whatever was there. Now I was just in this focusing mode as those birds landed, so I wonder if we got that. Notice I tried to put that frame over the birds as they were landing. And let's take a look here. Put it over the bird, and we got pretty close, but not exact. All right, not quite exact because they weren't exactly in that portion of the frame. All right, notice I've got some birds that are right here. If they're right there, it finds them. As they leave that crosshair, they go more and more and more out of frame. All right. So now let's change our focusing area from this point to a wide area here. And watch what happens at this point, because I do have subject tracking with this particular camera. And as we said before, if you have subject tracking, you want to use a wide area mode. So we're going to take this, and I've got these birds moving. It starts finding them and tries to follow them as they move through the frame. And when I take a look at that, I've certainly got them in focus, and we can see it following as they move. So what we're going to do now is we are in a wide autofocus mode because I have subject tracking, otherwise I'd be in some form of a crosshair selection, and we're just going to do some shooting and see what we get. So here we go.
So now we're looking at some footage I shot as I was shooting the birds. And I want to notice here as these birds are landing that the tracking system is constantly trying to find the subject because I had to work so quickly. If I was working with a single crosshair, I could have tried to place it over one of the birds, but then my camera movement would have been far more erratic. So that type of a system does not work perfectly, but did eventually find the bird as it was landing. And here it's able to find these birds in the sky a lot more quickly because they stood out very easily against the background. But as these birds are flying away from me and landing in this picture and in the next one, a continuous focusing system is going to be the best tool for finding them and keeping them in focus as they move away or towards my camera and land. So that's really the best tool for this type of an environment, as we can see here.
So we've explored two of the main three characteristics of light. We said that there were five characteristics of light, right? Direction, brightness, those are the two that we were really going to care about. Two that we're not particularly caring about, and that's going to be specularity and contrast. And then a fifth one. The fifth one was going to be color temperature. Color temperature. Now it's time to start dealing with color temperature, an accurate color in our shots. So let's start exploring that concept. The first mistake that people make is they think color temperature is somehow related to brightness, that as I change brightness, I change color temperature. This is not in any way necessarily true. Remember, we've differentiated them in the characteristics of light that we've started this class with. So there are a couple situations where the brightness of light does affect the color temperature, specifically if there is some effect or medium that's making light dimmer, that might also change color temperature. Being underwater is actually one of those situations where being underwater, light is getting dimmer and the water actually attenuates out the warm part of the color spectrum. So we lose that warm tone, we lose full color spectrum light, and this is why your underwater scenes always look blue. All right? But mostly color temperature is not related to the brightness of the light source. It's its own thing. And we need to think about the way that color is really managed by light sources, how that's reflected, and how we deal with it as photographers. So here we go. I think it's best to start by understanding that we are spoiled when it comes to color temperature. We're spoiled. We have sunlight. And sunlight is what we call a full color spectrum light. In other words, all colors are represented in the light wave. And so when you take it and you shine it on something that is white, it looks white because there's no inherent color to the light source to change something's color. This is why clouds are white, by the way. This is why snow looks white, because the light source lighting them is full color spectrum. And the human eye evolved to take maximum advantage of the only significant light source that it had, and that was the sun. So we are accustomed to full color spectrum light. We are evolved to take advantage of full color spectrum light. Now, that's not to say that the human visual system doesn't have ways of dealing with non-full color spectrum light. Okay? The human brain does something quite amazing that cameras simply cannot reproduce. It knows what you're looking at because you're intelligent and you know the things that you're looking at, and it knows what color they're supposed to be. And the brain can actually process the information coming in through your eyes so that what you're looking at looks more or less correct to you. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Let's say you're sitting in your living room and you are watching TV, but the dog needs to go out. So you pause the TV, there are no other lights on in the room, you get the leash on the dog, you walk outside. Now you're on the sidewalk and you look back in through the window into your living room. And the room looks green. Why? Because it's only being lit by that TV that's on. When you were in the room, it didn't look green, it looked normal. But now that you're outside, and this part of what you're viewing is only a small portion, and you're inside of this larger environment that's probably lit by moonlight at this point, I'm imagining this is taking place at night, then it all of a sudden looks the way that it really does look, being lit by this television set. In other words, depending on what you're adapted to, the room looks either correct or incorrect. Now, your camera doesn't know the difference. So there are lots of different ways that light sources can be incomplete. Most light sources are not full color spectrum lights. We just have sunlight, which spoils us. So sunlight is full color spectrum light unless it gets filtered. So if sunlight gets filtered by clouds, it attenuates out the warm part of the color spectrum, and now you have shade that's a little bit cool, or a cloudy day that's a little bit cool in color temperature. You may have seen that. You have incandescent lights, which are very yellow. You have fluorescent lights, which are never full color spectrum, but they have different signatures. Some of them are going to be sodium vapor, some of them are going to be relatively daylight. You have some older ones that are a horrid green. You have all different colors of fluorescence. You have lots of different light sources, and most of them are not made to be what we would call full color spectrum light. So we need to be able to deal with this as photographers. Now, your camera came out of the box with white balance set to what's called AWB, or auto white balance. Now you're going to have a button that says white balance or WB on it. And even if you don't have that, it will be in the quick menu of your camera. It always is in one of those two places, because this is important. It's put right up front for you to control. So we have white balance to deal with. And what does auto white balance do? Well, auto white balance is going to be something that shoots a picture and examines it pixel for pixel to determine what the most predominant color is. It then assumes that that most predominant color has something to do with the light source that's lighting the subject, and then it adjusts the entire frame globally, which means all pixels, in order to adjust that color temperature of that light source to be even. Now, that's what your camera's been doing all along, and if you've seen inconsistencies, inaccuracies, fluctuations, this is why: inaccurate color. Auto white balance will be fooled by the actual color of objects. Let me give you an extreme example so that you can understand this properly. But know that this is an extreme example, but something like this happens every image you ever shoot. Let's say that you're asked to shoot the team photo for a kid's Little League soccer team. All right, let's say that you are. And they want the picture taken at the park just right after practice. So you go to the park. Soccer is a summertime sport, so the park is really nice and green. And let's say, for purposes of discussion, that the jersey color of the team is green. So green jerseys, they're on green grass, and there's some trees behind them, and the trees are green. There's a lot of green in this scene, all right? You shoot a picture. Now, if you remember your color wheel from, grade school, you'll remember that green is opposite of magenta. That color wheel is actually very useful for us as photographers. So green and magenta are opposites. If the camera decides the color temperature of the light source has something to do with green, it's going to add magenta to compensate. Your greens are going to get duller, and everyone's skin tone is going to turn a little bit blotchy and reddish. And the reason why is auto white balance. Now, if you were shooting this image on a nice cloudless day, then direct sunlight was actually the color temperature of your light source, wasn't it? So you really needed to be in something that tells the camera you are in a situation with nice direct sunlight as the color temperature, not something that automatically adjusts because the green is accurate. Something like this situation happens every picture you ever take in auto. So auto white balance is going to be something that is both a little bit inaccurate or a lot inaccurate, and it fluctuates every picture. That fluctuation is important. As we're going to examine this is the beginning part of our white balance discussion. There's going to be a little bit more advanced discussion of white balance. Fluctuation is going to be difficult for editing purposes. So we have light sources. These light sources are going to, by and large, be non-complete color spectrum lighting. And auto white balance will probably get us in the vicinity, but it's going to have issues. We're going to have some relatively simple and automated ways of telling the camera the color temperature that we want to be in, and we're exploring those next. And there are going to be some ways of telling the camera the exact color temperature that we're in, and we're exploring those in the next section. But right now, I want to take you out of auto white balance and show you the basic presets that you can use to get that little bit of more accurate color immediately. Let's take a look at choosing white balance presets. Now I'm outside, which means I'm in direct sunlight. And my camera's pointed out here in the direct sunlight environment. So we're going to take a look at our white balance presets. And we've got an auto white balance, which we know is going to reevaluate with every photograph we take and fluctuate based on the objects within the scene. The other ones are going to inform the camera of the type of lighting that it's in. So this is going to be direct sunlight. And if we take a look here, it's actually reading the direct sunlight relatively well in an auto white balance environment. But let's keep going down here. I've got shade, I've got cloudy day, I've got incandescent, and then I have several different fluorescents here. Yours may or may not have all of the same fluorescent options: warm white, cool white, day white, daylight. This is if a flash is the predominant light source. This is if the camera's in an underwater housing and is underwater. And that's necessary because when the camera's underwater, the water really attenuates out a lot of the warm tones from the light. And then I have custom white balances, which we're getting to in another section. So let's take a look here. This is direct sunlight of this scene, and that's a really nice and accurate way of looking at the color. But if I point my camera over here, I've got an awning, and leaving the camera in this direct sunlight is just not going to be as accurate. If I take a look here, this direct sunlight is too cool. It's expecting the light to be relatively warm, but this shot actually needs to be warmed up in order to get accurate color. So I'm going to go down here to shade, and I'm going to take a look at that and maybe shoot a picture of that. And I wonder if there's a difference to auto white balance. Shoot that picture. If I take a look at these, there's a big difference here between what the shade white balance is here, which is nice and vibrant and colorful, to the auto white balance, which is too cool and a little bit desaturated. So telling the camera that this was a shady environment gave me a much more accurate image. So let's take that idea and expand on it. That's all well and good, except when it doesn't work. What if I'm in an environment that has mixed light sources, mixed color temperature light sources? What if I'm in an environment where there are lighting fixtures that do not match the color temperature presets I've already been working with? Or what if I'm in an environment where I need exacting white balance accuracy? In those instances, my presets will not be close enough. They're blunt instruments, and I'm trying to use them to do sculpture work, right? So instead, I need to understand something about the way that color can shift, and I need to understand something about the way that we measure it and correct for it. And that's what we're getting into in this section. So first, let's talk about color shift. Color can shift in a light source from yellows to blues to start with. So think of that as one set of correction. A light can shift along a line from yellows to blues. And we measure this with the Kelvin temperature scale. We use Kelvin as the measurement system because it has no negative numbers, which avoids confusion. It would definitely be problematic if we had the possibility of having 3,000 degrees Kelvin and negative 3,000 degrees Kelvin and accidentally getting something very wrong based on that one small mistake. So instead, we work with a color temperature scale that has no negative numbers. So let's put some numbers to certain light sources so we can understand them. This is a shift from yellows and warm tones, reds and oranges, to cooler color temperatures, blues and purples, and a little bit of greens, but mostly blues and purples. So starting with deep warm tones, candlelight is around 1800 degrees Kelvin. Incandescent fixtures are between 2200 degrees and 2900 degrees Kelvin, and in fact they tend to fluctuate in their color temperature as they're left on, meaning that they can't be used for very serious video work because you'll get fluctuations in color temperature as you work. Photofluids we use for video when we're trying to warm up skin tone is 3500 degrees Kelvin by and large. And direct sunlight and sunlight balanced video lights, which are what are lighting me right now, are 5500 degrees Kelvin. When you go to cooler color temperatures, of course, we're getting larger numbers than 5500 degrees. So shade, or if a cloud is casting a shadow onto a subject, that's 6000 to 6500 degrees Kelvin. Really ugly greenish fluorescent lights can hit the 7000 range. And in moonlight, we can hit 8000 degrees Kelvin before we start getting into a numbering system that leaves the ability for the human eye to actually perceive that part of the spectrum. So that's the shift from yellows to blues. And you could, with cameras, directly select Kelvin, though I don't like to do that. One reason is that it's more time consuming than the technique I'm going to show you. And the second reason I don't like doing it is that it doesn't take the full amount of color shift possibilities into account, because color can also shift in the magenta to green scale. And in that example that we talked about in a previous lecture of shooting pictures of a Little League soccer team with green jerseys, and that would add magenta to skin tones, that's a green to magenta shift that is completely independent of shooting and having a yellow to blue shift. And there's not a temperature measurement scale that we use for measuring this green to magenta shift. We call it tint. So we could directly select in a 4-quadrant graph the type of color shifting that we're seeing. But rather than doing that, we can do calibration, which is where we have a known standard. It measures what it sees, compares that to what it should see, and builds a set of corrections to make one into the other. That's what calibration is. And for calibrating color temperature, we use our trusty 18% gray cloth. This is a known standard in color in photography. And if we tell our camera to do a custom white balance where it measures something in order to build a profile, it's expecting to find 18% gray. And we use 18% gray rather than white because of its lack of reflectivity. So, In custom white balance, we can hold up an 18% gray card or cloth, I prefer my cloth, measure it, and it will build a profile to give us accurate color temperature. And we're going to be doing that in the mechanics and practical example to follow in this set part of the course. And that's going to work perfectly fine for us. It's easier than selecting Kelvin or choosing a color temperature in a 4-quadrant graph. Another way is going to be to use a calibrating tool, but to make the correction after the fact, not before. Here's how we do that. We're going to shoot in some environment, and we take a picture of our calibrating tool, 18% gray card or cloth. Now, to make this work, we cannot be in auto white balance because auto will re-correct every image as it shoots, meaning that it's correcting these images to different degrees. So I cannot apply a global correction to all of them. So I need to be in something else that's going to be a fixed color temperature. And it doesn't matter if it's right or wrong. It really doesn't. As long as I'm shooting the images in RAW, as opposed to JPEG. RAW images have full color spectrum data behind every pixel, meaning I can actually change green into orange if I want to. I can't do that to nearly the same degree of accuracy as I can with a JPEG image. And I'll give you a little bit of understanding of why. Here's how a JPEG operates. Let's say I shot a picture of a blue cup. A RAW image would display blue, but maintain full color spectrum data behind those pixels. A JPEG does not say this is blue. Instead, what it does is discard all non-blue information. Now that might seem like the same thing until I get to editing. Let's say that this cup was actually supposed to be purple. Well, with a RAW image, you can just change blue into purple. It's no problem. But if I have a JPEG image, then I can't just change blue to purple. I have to shift the hue of the blue pixels to as close to purple as possible, and it's not nearly the same degree of information. So I do shoot all of my images in RAW. There are many reasons why, but this ability to do full color editing was the thing that made me do it full time. We are going to explore that technique of measuring at the moment of measuring after the fact by just shooting a picture of the cloth. We're going to examine that in an editing section of this course a little bit later on. Right now what we're going to do is we're going to take the camera, take our 18% gray cloth, and do some custom white balance settings. And we're going to do that next. What if we want to be as accurate as possible? What if we're in very strange lighting conditions? What if we are in mixed lighting conditions and we just can't get exactly the color that we want? Well, that's where we bring back this tool, our 18% gray cloth. 18% gray, as we have discussed, is a known neutral standard in photography. Known neutral standard in photography. Now that means that when we are trying to determine accurate color, we need to shoot a picture of something that is a known standard for comparison's sake. 18% gray is that tool for us in photography. So it can come in a card form of different sizes. I prefer a cloth, and the reason I prefer a cloth is it doubles as a perfectly good cleaning cloth for my screen, for my lenses, for the screen on my external recorder. And then I can use it very effectively for white balance customization. Let's take a look at how I can use custom white balance in my camera. So I've got my shot set up here, and let's make that a smidge darker. That's fine. And if I go into my menu, I'm going to be able to look around until I find my color options. And I don't like to remember where this is. I just look around until I find it. Color is labeled as a menu setting here. You'll also find this, of course, just standardly in your menu. You will have a direct button to get to white balance, and you will have this inside of your quick menu. So it's in multiple places. They want you to find this. If I look at my white balance options here. I'm going to see the presets we've already discussed. Auto white balance. I'm going to find my sunny day, shade, cloudy day, incandescent, several different types of fluorescence. If a flash is the predominant light source, if I'm in an underwater housing. And we've taken it that far already. Here are the other ones. What if I want to manually select Kelvin? Remember me talking about a 4-quadrant system. If I go into this, I can actually see that 4-quadrant system. I can see yellow and blue, which is labeled as A and B, and I can see green to magenta, which is labeled G to M. And if I take this, I can navigate that 4-quadrant system and adjust as if that combination was my exact color temperature of my light source. Now, as I said before, I'm actually not a giant fan of doing this for time reasons, even though it does change live on my screen as I do this, as you can see. So it's not that it's not accurate. My issue is just that it takes a long time for me to find what I'm looking for. Instead of that, I prefer to use a custom white balance. Now, the symbol for custom white balance is always the same. It's a square and 2 triangles, as you're seeing here. If you see multiples of these labeled, in my case 1, 2, and 3, these are additional registers. I've seen cameras have as few as 1 and as many as 6 registers. Mine has 3, that's fine. And these are places where you can remember a particular lighting condition or set of lights. In my case, right now, I'm being lit with 2 video lights. At the beginning of this course, I white balanced for those lights and saved them as a register on the camera that's filming right now. Whenever I want to shoot, all I have to do is take the camera and put it to that register, and these lights are automatically white balanced. The same would be true if you shot in the same environment. So parents who shoot swim meets, if they walk into this terrible lighting situation, every week they can white balance to it, save it as a register, and come back to it every day or every week or whenever they're shooting. So there's lots of uses for these registers. At the bottom, I'm going to find something that says set. It might just say custom, and this is where you actually measure. So let's go into that. And it's going to give me this little circle, and it's telling me put the circle over your known neutral standard. Now, we don't like to use pure white in photography. The reason that we don't like to use pure white is that pure white can reflect the color of the things around it. So if you're sitting near somebody with a green shirt or something like that, that color can pollute your adjustment. Gray, like this, is non-reflective to those other objects in the room, so we prefer gray. I'm going to put that circle that I see right over my 18% gray cloth, and it says press the center button in order to capture the data. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And it's going to shoot a photograph that it's not saving for purposes of actually shooting the images or actually recording it. It's just using it for adjustment purposes. And in this case, it says, hey, this is pretty simple. This is 5,500 degree Kelvin light, and we didn't need to do an adjustment in the A to B, which is the yellow to blue scale, or the GM green magenta scale. Well, that's nice. That means that auto white balance would have actually been pretty close. But now I can select the register. Notice it says 1 at the top. And if I scroll around, I can save this to any one of my registers. So let's save it to register 3. So this is my custom white balance adjusted shot. What if I compare this to an auto white balance? Well, in this case, it actually looks pretty similar. Why does it look similar? Because it said that, let's adjust that focusing system. It said that it didn't need to make any significant adjustments. What I want to do is take this exact same concept and go someplace where there is going to be some kind of adjustments I need to make. And I want to see the difference between auto white balance and a manually adjusted white balance. But before we get there, another way of doing accurate white balance is first I make sure I'm shooting in RAW, which is going to be the very first thing in the menu. So if I'm here, oops, this is the very beginning of my menu. It says, what file format do you want to shoot? That's where you're going to find RAW or JPEG. If you shoot in RAW format, as I recommend you do, every pixel has full color spectrum data inside of every image you ever shoot. That means that I can shoot an image of something that is a known neutral, and so long as I'm not in a, let's go here, way wrong. So long as I am not in an auto white balance mode, it will shoot and record every image wrong, but it will be the same degree of wrong. So if I shoot an image of this cloth here, take it into my photo editing software, and click on that gray and say, this is accurate, it will adjust perfectly, and then I can use that edit for every other image inside of that space. You just have to have a known neutral standard, and you need to be shooting in RAW for that to work, but it does work. Now let's take this exact concept and let's go shooting. Let's put this into practice. Let's go ahead and take our 18% gray cloth and let's do a customized white balance right inside of this basement with these very ugly overhead lights. And I want to get accurate color inside of this room. So if I shot an auto white balance, it would look like this, and that might be okay, but I know that it's not fully accurate. So we're going to go to our white balance options and go over to do a custom. And when I go there, I just take that 18% gray cloth, I just put it just right there over that circle, and I'm going to measure it. And then it's saying that it did some adjustments, and it asks me to select a register, so I'm just going to select one. And now I can shoot another picture. And if I take a look at these two, I'm going to see a noticeable difference between them inside of this tricky lighting condition. If I look at this one, which was auto, and that one there is going to be my corrected, the auto is adding quite a bit of magenta in. That's probably because this beanbag chair is teal or green, and it's going to be forcing an auto white balance to correct by adding magenta back in. So we don't really want that. We want accurate color. And when we did this corrected, we can see the 18% gray cloth go from a little bit warm to corrected inside of these two images. And that corrects for the lighting condition that we're inside of. So just that little trick right there is going to let us gain accurate white balance at any environment that we step inside of. So customized white balance right off of the camera using an 18% gray cloth, and that's how we can work in any environment. Let's take a brief look now at taking these images and having some kind of a workflow in our editing process. Along the way, we're going to look at importing and exporting. We're going to take a look at a white balance control technique that I've talked about a few times in this course. And we're also going to be taking a look at some of the very basic edits we're able to do. To get full use out of this section of the class, you will do best to be shooting in RAW, though the techniques we're talking about will also apply to JPEG images, just not nearly with as much latitude for editing. With that, I'm going to take the memory card out of my camera, we're going to pop it in the computer, and we're going to see what we get.
So we're sitting at the computer, and I'm putting my memory card into the card reader of my my computer, and it brings up the import dialog for my chosen editing program, which is Capture One. Now this will work the same with really any editing program that you have. And we have the images from class as well as some other images from the memory card on here. And I want to take you through bringing in images from a memory card that are from several different shoots. So if we scroll down, we've got a lot of pictures of my son, and then we also have some pictures that we shot at the lake when the birds were landing. And if we keep scrolling, we're going to find quite a number of things from when we were shooting. And right now, I'm going to take a look at just importing all of these, and I want to show you my preferred method of keeping things very well organized, which is a naming system. So if I look over here, then I really only have one catalog that I import things into, and I can put in a job name if I want to. And so what I'm going to do is type in new just so that I can find a way of organizing them, but I'm going to change that name in a little bit. And I could add copyright descriptions or full image descriptions if I wanted to, but I'm just going to hit import all. So this is going to start bringing the images into Capture One, and it's going to tell me how long I have left remaining up here. I'm going to bring up Capture One, and it's bringing in my images right over here. And it's telling me that there's a number of images coming in, and it tells me how long they're going to be coming in for. So it's going to say that they're going to take about 20 minutes to come in. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to let that run, and we're going to come back when it's finished. So we finished loading the images, and now we want to take a look at them. So I have them in my little panel down here, but I want to see that a little bit more fully. And I want to show you a fast way of being able to do some sorting. So a lot of organization goes into the thought process in good image management. So I've got some images from class, and these are ones that you'll remember from some of our lectures, Shooting at the Lake. And now I've got some pictures there of my son. So we're just going to highlight all of these together. And they came in, as you can see, labeled as new, and then they give a date where they were shot. So we know the date that these were shot on. Well, I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to batch rename just these selected ones, and I'm going to change it to, instead of being new, to Nathan, because that's my son's name. And why that's really important, I'll say in a moment. But we're going to just rename those. And now what it's doing is it's naming them, and then it organizes by date, and since Nathan comes before new, it moves them farther up. So now I have stuff from class. So here we've got a bunch of things from class. This is when we were shooting birds at the park. And we're going to keep scrolling down here because all this stuff is for class. That's all good. But I know that down here a little ways, here's some more pictures. So we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to go down here, and we're going to just grab all of those. And same thing, batch rename, and change it to Nathan, and rename those. Now that's going to put all of the Nathan images together and all of the images for class together. And it's going to take about 10 seconds to rename those 134 images, as we can see on the screen. Once that is done, we can do something pretty powerful. We can scroll to the bottom here and find just our images for class. I selected the bottom one, and I'm scrolling up, and what I'm looking for is the first image from class, and it's right there. So now I've highlighted just the images from class. I'm going to batch rename these. Instead of Nathan, they're going to be, let's see, photography essentials, let's say. And then I'm going to rename those. Now, why is that going to be so important? The reason is over here, I have my user collections. And these are collections of images that have something to do with each other. And if I look at these, I've got a personal and I've got a business. And what I want to do is create a new smart album. And the smart album is going to be photography essentials. And we're going to put in a search criteria. And I want the display name to contain the word essentials. And now we're going to hit OK. So this photography essentials is going to go into my Camera Lessons Online folder. And inside of here, I'll find photography essentials. And you'll notice the images from class show up immediately. And if I was to import a new image, then I could name it photography essentials, and it would automatically populate into this folder. Now look how I've done that with personal. I have stuff with family, stuff with travel, and if I go into family, I'll have Nathan 1 year old, Nathan's first year. So if I go into Nathan 1 year old, you're going to see that the images that I imported and renamed are already in here because it has two search criterion. It is everything that has Nathan in it and everything from his first birthday to his second birthday, meaning that I can automatically find an image from his first year or from his second year of life. So that's pretty easy for me to be able to find. Now we're going to go back into our photography course, and we're going to do a little bit of some editing here, just some basic essentials, and then how do we export a finished file. So that's what we really want to examine. Now, notice the image name. I like to name something with an event and a date. And then this last part, ARW, is the raw file from my particular camera. And so we know that all of these are raw files. So I don't need to see all of these in this kind of broader context. I'm going to bring these down a little bit. I think something like that. Yeah, like there should be just fine. And now let's do a white balance edit. Now I've been talking about this throughout most of the class. And here's an image shot of my bookshelf. And you'll notice that the white balance is way off. Way off. So I've got two of these here. Here's the other one. And the white balance is just terrible in this image. I intentionally set it to an incandescent white balance. But up here, I've got some tools, and I'm going to find a pick white balance option, which gives me a little tool. And I should be able to put that over my 18% gray cloth. Click somewhere, and I should be able to immediately correct the image. And that is an accurate white balance. Notice that the white in the bookshelf turned white. Well, now I can copy that edit. Here's another image shot in the same white balance. If I go over, I can paste that white balance and immediately correct it. And I could do this for 1 or for 50 images, and I'd be able to correct my white balance immediately. So that is the trick of simply taking an image of the white balance cloth, correcting it, copying that edit, and pasting it onto other images. So now I have a finished photograph here that I would be able to work with. So that's some basic white balance editing. Now I want to get into a little bit of some more color correction editing. So here is our image of the sunset at the lake. And we had several of these that we liked. And I'm kind of seeing which one do I really like the view of best here. And I think that let's go with this one here and take a look at it. And I'm going to bring up my image editing options here. So over here I have my distributions, my histogram, both in the brightness as well as my red, green, and blue channels. And I can move what midpoint is. So if I move my midpoint, then I can make the whole image brighter or darker. Notice that color saturation changes as the image gets brighter or darker. I have my highlights and my shadows, exposure, contrast, brightness, saturation. So I just want to show you a couple basic things that we're able to do with an image. I want to think about how dark I want the image itself to be. So what I might do here is move that down. Why? Because it defines what's a highlight and what's a shadow. So if I just bring up my shadows, I can just bring up one part of the frame and have a little bit of detail there if I want to. And that did not change the brightness of my sky. If I just change brightness overall, then I can kill that color contrast in the sky. So what I sometimes like to do is change where midpoint is, and that really lets me control my edits of my highlights and my shadows effectively. So what I might want to do here is take a look at some color. And this is a sunset photograph. And I might want to take my image, and what if I want to change its color temperature? So this is making it look like it's nighttime there. That's a little bit too blue, of course. But if I bring this kind of there, I've really added this sense of it being, nighttime. And I might bring that up a little bit. What if I want that to be, notice we can do some edits this way. Let's say 4800. And just a little bit of blue in the sky. But if I'm over here, I could take my saturation of colors, and I can bump that up a little bit. I'm trying to pull some color in here. Well, I might say, that's all right, but that's a little bit too blue on my part. One thing that I might be able to do in my color editor is, what if I want to, let's see here, let's pick a color. What if I want to pick like that tone right there? I could take just that tone and try to pull it in and add some warmth to that section where all of my sunset colors are coming in. So these are some editing possibilities that I can do. But what if I just want to pull information back? Well, let's change images to do that. Here's one of our images from when we were working on our focusing editing, and I don't like this darkness of the tree. I'm not thrilled with some aspects of the image. So let's go over here, and what I might want to do is take my highlights and see what happens if I start pulling those in. And I can actually pull them in pretty reasonably there. Now if I make the shot a little bit darker, I move my midpoint a little bit, I can pull in my highlights some and try to pull some detail back from that area. And then my shadows, what if I pull some of those in? Well, that gives me information all the way through here and a little bit inside of the tree. If I then went over here and said this is a sunset photograph and I really want to work with the sunset aspect of it, well, I can take my Kelvin and I can make that a little bit warmer. What if I made that, let's say 6000? I'm going to warm up the shot a little bit and add to that sunset kind of feeling that we had. So I've added some color and I've pulled in some detail, which is really nice. Now what if I really liked that particular image? Well, if I really enjoyed that, I might be able to say, hey, I love this shot. Let's make this a 5-star image. Now, how can that be useful? If I'm editing over here, I might say, all right, I'm inside of this workflow. I leave, I come back and say, I just want to find my 5-star images. Well, here they are right here. If I click on that, only one image shows up. Only one, and it's this one right here. I'm not finding any other images. So I have no ratings and then from 1 through 5. Now, this is a way of me being able to find an image I worked with really well. Some people use some color editors. Some people will say, hey, this image right here, I want to make this a red image. And red means I'm not done editing yet. And then when I'm finished editing it, I might make it green. Well, I've seen that used a lot. When I'm working on images to write for one of the books for the website, I use a system where images I haven't used yet in the book are one color and images I have are another color. So that's really useful for me. Now, what if I'm done editing this and I want to export it? I want to have a version for me to print and to hang on my wall. Well, what I'll do there is I will export a version of the image. Because remember, this is a raw file. And so I haven't changed this image. I can export the original, which is without the edits, or I can export a variant, which is with the edits. So if I export a variant, I have a job name. So this would be, let's say it's a test. And then I do like to have a counter in case I'm exporting multiple images, and then the date. And I always export to my desktop because I grab these images and I use them right away. So if I export that, it's going to tell me its progress right up here. And when that's done, I should have an image right there. And you'll notice it's changed its name to test, where over here it's photography essentials, because the exported file is different than the original. So now I have a finished image over here for me to open up and to do with whatever I would like. So that we have that. And that is going to be an easy way of exporting. And we don't have to just do any one file. What if I wanted to export multiple files? Well, I could highlight multiples across the board here, apply the same edits to them, and then I could export all of them and just have a series that I exported. So that's how I can have finished products that I do something with. It's also how I can export one at a time or multiples, or do edits to one at a time or to multiples. Now, when we were shooting at one of the parks that we went to, I quite liked this little place, but I thought that it might look good as a black and white kind of image. So let's take a look at that. If I go to my color editor, then I do have the option for doing some black and white work. So I'm going to enable black and white, and I can do some pretty interesting things with black and white images. So if I take this out of black and white, you'll notice that there's a lot of yellow and warm tones here, and blue tones here, and green tones here. All right. Well, let's see what I can do with these kind of warmer tones. If I take my yellows, I can change just the yellow tones and either block them out or allow them in. And so this is just a yellow filter. Now, if we were to do this much yellow editing with a color image, it would look very strange. But with a black and white image, I can really get away with it quite well. So I don't want to darken it. I think opening that up would look pretty good. Now let's take the blues, and I can do the same thing with my blue tones, but I might want to make those a little bit darker. And I might take this green, I might kind of darken that there. So now I've got this totally different image than I had before. Now what else could I do with this? Well, let's see. I could bump my contrast with it, because you can stretch the contrast of a black and white image quite a bit more than you can a normal image. So here I have a black and white version of this original file. And if I go back to my black and white mode, and this is my with and my without. And I really do think that this particular subject matter deals well from being a black and white image. Now I could go and I could export that one just the same as we did before. But I could copy all of these edits, come back here, find a series of these, for instance, perhaps this one and perhaps this one, and I could paste those edits onto both of those. And after pasting them, this one here actually has strangely become my favorite. Sometimes that happens. Now I think what I might want to do is just look at this image for a second. And I've already got kind of a natural vignette from the sky, but I think I might accentuate that. I think I might take it and I might vignette that a little bit, kind of like that. Might bump my exposure by a little bit. And I've got this very old kind of feeling shot. And that's actually an image I could export a variant of. And this one would be, let's say, old building. Export it. Less than a minute left. And notice that when this comes out, it was shot in RAW. It's coming out as a JPEG because I'm processing out a universally readable file. And that JPEG is winding up, let's actually just highlight it and take a look at it, 14.8 megabytes. That's larger than if I had just shot a JPEG, meaning that if you shoot a RAW image and you produce a JPEG, it is a larger and higher quality JPEG than if you had just shot one. And I've got all of the data inside of the frame, and I would be able to take this data and reproduce a totally different image, maybe a poppy color kind of image if I wanted to. So that's some basics of workflow and of editing. And the important thing is, this is my imports, but I very rarely touch that. Everything is organized inside of here. Let's take an image that was underexposed and see what we can do with it. So if I go, I know that I have some underexposed shots in here. I just know for a fact that I do. But they're shot in RAW, and so I have a lot of capability with these. So this is an underexposed shot right here, but I bet I even have darker ones. I bet that I do. How about this? So here's a pretty dark shot, and definitely underexposed. If I take a look over here, my histogram is bunched up on the left side. But if I just take my midtone slider and move it, I have an image that's now pretty close. Not perfect, but pretty close. Now I can bring my exposure in a little bit. I like to add some contrast. What about white balance? Was that off? Well, I don't have my 18% gray cloth because this was just shot kind of on the fly. The closest thing I can do is try to find something that's a neutral white. Now, I'm going to tell you this is not as good as an actual 18% gray cloth. And the reason it's not as good is that I don't know that this tone is actually a known standard. I don't know that it is. So I would say this is a little bit too green by looking at it. But if I take my color editor here, and let's see, got my tint. Remember, tint is green and magenta. So if I go one direction, I'm adding magenta. Go in another direction, I add green. So I might say something there might be pretty good. It's not perfect. I don't have any reference point to know that it's perfect, but I'd say it's pretty good. Now this is obviously an image that if we zoom in on it is grainy, is a little bit motion blurred, but I could use that for my basic edit. Notice I've got these other images here all shot at the same time. I can just highlight those and then paste my whole series of edits onto it and take a look and say, hey, this right here, that one right there, it's actually kind of a fun image. And now I might rate it. Now I might work with it a little bit more. And it makes my editing process faster and my export faster. And then these are my images I'm going to do something with. So that's some basics on some workflow and some editing that can make your life a little bit easier.
And now we arrive at the end. We arrive at a place where we understand the essential mechanisms of our camera, the essential things we need in order to be able to go out and start shooting fantastic photographs right away. We understand how the exposure system works and how to manipulate it and to manually control it. We understand how to get accurate color temperature, and we understand our focusing operation. We should be able to walk into any environment and be able to shoot accurately, both getting the exposure we want, getting it consistently, and acquiring focus accurately on our subjects. Along the way, I hope that I've inspired you to start shooting more creatively, and shooting things that interest you, things that make you excited as an artist, because you are an artist. We are all capable of extreme forms of personality and expression, and your voice as a photographer is different than anybody else's. I promise you that. I teach quite a number of classes where we print images at the end, and everybody came and shot the same subjects, and yet the results that every student creates are different. And so your voice as a photographer is different than anybody else's, even when shooting the same subject matter. And you just need to exercise that strength. And that's what shooting is going to be. We are all creative. And we all can be artists. There's this idea that, oh, photography is something that's, because there's technology involved, anybody can do it. And that's true, anyone can do it, but that doesn't mean everyone can do it well, because there's craft involved, there's theory involved. And getting out and practicing those things is the only way to get better. Every time of year is a good time of year to be a photographer. Anytime you pick up a camera is a good time to pick up a camera. And set a goal of creating something that's meaningful to you and to decorating with your own art. If you are ever in doubt of your capacity to be a photographer, just remember, every great photograph that you've ever seen has been taken with equipment that's probably older than yours. And so you are on the cutting edge. And there's nothing about this craft that you can't tackle and completely master. There's a lot of things in your camera you don't need to worry about. I've shown you the essentials of what's necessary to be able to operate and do consistently great work. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Continue to go out and shoot. Obviously, take a look at the other educational products I have on the website, cameralessonsonline.com. You can get in touch with me through that website and go out and shoot some great pictures. Thank you.